The hardest part of being thrown out of your own empire isn't the humiliation. It is trying not to laugh on your way to the elevator. The heaviest sound in Newport isn't the crash of the Atlantic Ocean against the seawall. It is the definitive, weighted thud of custom mahogany doors sealing shut. I stood alone on the woven runner of the executive corridor at Bailey Maritime, staring at the brass handle that had just clicked locked from the inside. Through the thick wood, the muffled sharp pop of a champagne cork echoed. They were celebrating. Welcome to Amanda Told Stories. How old were you when you realized your family loved what you could do for them more than they loved you? Let me know in the comments. Less than 2 minutes prior, I was seated at the far end of the boardroom table. The air inside smelled of salt, expensive leather, and betrayal. My father Charles sat at the head, his expression cold, delivering the verdict. I was officially removed from the family's maritime logistics legacy. My mother Virginia spent the entire ambush adjusting her pearl necklace, her eyes meticulously tracing the wood grain of the table to avoid my gaze. Then there was Preston, my younger brother, the golden child. He sat beside our parents, a smug curl resting on his lips, hiding behind a crystal water glass. To ensure my departure, Preston's new corporate partner, a slick suit named Nolan, had stepped forward, gesturing toward the exit like a bouncer. Right before the doors closed, the defining image burned into my memory. Preston lifted a bottle of 2015 Chateau Petrus. $5,000 of fermented grapes poured to commemorate my exile. To the future, he had crowed, raising his glass. And to trimming the dead weight. Most people would break down. I didn't argue. I didn't shed a tear. I simply offered a practiced quiet curve of my lips, turned on my heel, and walked away. I stepped out of the historic brick building and into the crisp, salt-laced Rhode Island wind. Seagulls circled the harbor, their cries cutting through the hum of commercial fishing boats and luxury yachts bobbing in the bay. This state operates on a unique cadence, a rapid, relentless pace driven by healthcare, higher education, and ocean tourism wrapped in the deep-rooted pride of maritime old money. The Baileys believed they owned that old money. They were popping corks for a $900 million marine biotech and logistics empire, convinced they had just executed a flawless corporate coup. What Charles, Virginia, and Preston failed to understand was a basic rule of modern economics. Executive titles mean nothing without equity. Walking toward my car parked near the docks, the smile I had been suppressing finally broke free. It wasn't a smile of defeat. It was the pulling of a pin from a grenade. Inside that boardroom, my family thought they had successfully removed me from the chessboard. They had no idea the empire they were toasting to was legally mine. I slipped behind the steering wheel, the leather cool against my hands, and glanced up at the top floor corner window. Let them drink the Petrus. The financial hangover arriving tomorrow would cost them every single thing they thought they owned. The engine of my car hummed a low, steady rhythm as I merged onto the coastal highway. Narragansett Bay stretched out to my right, an expanse of steel-gray water chopping under the afternoon wind. I rolled the window down just an inch, letting the sharp brine sting my cheeks. It cleared the lingering stench of polished leather and unearned arrogance from my lungs. My hands rested lightly on the steering wheel. My pulse, which by all logic should have been racing, beat with a slow, terrifying calm. I watched the sprawling waterfront estates of Newport blur past the passenger window. Generations of inherited wealth, guarded by iron gates and manicured hedges. My family lived behind one of those gates. They believed the brass plaque on their front pillar shielded them from consequence. They were wrong. To understand the magnitude of the mistake Charles and Preston just made, you have to understand the grave they were standing in 5 years ago. It was a Tuesday in late November, I remember because the rain was turning to sleet and the heating in the old Bailey Maritime warehouse had been shut off for non-payment. Preston had been handed the reins of the shipping fleet straight out of business school. A graduation present from a father who confused shared DNA with competence. Within 3 years, Preston turned a century-old logistical network into a bleeding financial carcass. He bought oversized cargo vessels we did not have the contracts to fill. He alienated our most reliable union dock workers to impress his country club friends with ruthless cost-cutting. He bet the entire family legacy on a series of predatory loans, thinking he could outsmart the interest rates. He failed. The banks circled. Foreclosure notices piled up on Charles' mahogany desk like snowdrifts. I remember standing in the doorway of the home office watching my father pour his third scotch of the morning while Preston paced the Persian rug blaming the economy, the unions, the weather, anything but his own signature on the dotted line. The fleet was 90 days away from being sold for scrap. The family name was days away from being dragged through the regional business journals as a cautionary tale. They needed a miracle. I gave them an invisible one. I started small, securing regional medical supply chains, then scaling up into specialized marine biotech transport. While Preston was attending charity galas in tailored tuxedos, I was standing in freezing shipyards at 3 a.m, inspecting cargo holds. I built Oceanic Apex Solutions from a cramped studio apartment, fueled by cheap coffee and a discipline born of necessity. I hired brilliant logisticians. I cultivated relationships with state healthcare providers. By the time the Bailey fleet was drowning under Preston and Charles' Oceanic Apex, was a quiet, liquid juggernaut. I could have let them sink into the harbor. I should have. But the name painted on the side of those rusting cargo ships was still my name. I felt a misguided duty to protect the foundation my grandfather had built with his bare hands. So I moved, quietly, operating through layers of legal separation. I instructed my corporate attorneys to approach the creditors representing a blind holding company. I bought the Bailey debt for pennies on the dollar, pulling the family business out of the foreclosure fires. I absorbed the rotting fleet into the Oceanic Apex infrastructure, restructuring it on paper as a heavily restricted subsidiary. But I knew my father and my brother too well. If they knew I held their leash, their fragile pride would shatter. They would rather go bankrupt and lose the estate than answer to the daughter they had always dismissed as a secondary asset. So, I built an elaborate illusion to save them from themselves. I let them believe a faceless private equity board out of New York had recognized the hidden value in the Bailey brand. I had my lawyers draft a meticulous operating agreement that kept Preston in the chief executive chair of his little subsidiary, keeping his inflated salary and his corner office with the harbor view. The contract was full of strict performance metrics and spending caps, but Preston never read past the page that secured his title. He thought he charmed the invisible investors during a single phone call. He thought his brilliant negotiating skills had saved the day. He had no idea the faceless board he feared and revered, the investors he sent weekly groveling updates to, was just his sister, reviewing his expense reports at midnight from a kitchen island in Providence. For 5 years, I played the mule. I carried the crushing weight of their financial survival, while they paraded around Rhode Island high society, taking full credit for the miraculous turnaround. Sunday dinners were a masterclass in psychological endurance. I would sit across the long mahogany dining table, slicing my roast beef, while Preston held court. He would brag about the quarterly earnings, attributing every optimized shipping route and lucrative biotech contract to his visionary leadership. Those contracts were negotiated by my team. Those routes were mapped by my proprietary algorithms. Charles would raise his heavy crystal glass to his son, declaring him the undeniable savior of the bloodline. Then my father would turn his patronizing gaze to me, clearing his throat. He would ask if I was still doing that little shipping side project of mine. He would lean forward, using a tone usually reserved for a slow child, and suggest I let Preston take a look at my books, maybe offer some much-needed guidance. Virginia would chime in, stirring her tea, suggesting I dress a little softer so I could find a husband who could take care of me instead of stressing over freight manifests. I swallowed the insults. I nodded, politely tasting the metallic tang of bitten-back words. I let them keep the illusion because I believed family protected family. I thought my silent sacrifice was a noble burden. I thought giving them the space to feel important was an act of grace. But grace requires a recipient willing to learn, and the spectacle in the boardroom today proved they had learned nothing. They did not just ask me to step down from my advisory role. They paraded a corporate liquidator in front of me to orchestrate a public, humiliating eviction. They poured a vintage wine to celebrate severing my ties to the only thing I had ever bled to save. They looked at me, not as a daughter or a sister, but as a problem they had successfully discarded. The highway curved sharply, wrapping around the edge of a rocky peninsula. I checked my mirrors, signaled, and pulled the car onto an empty, scenic overlook. The tires crunched over the loose gravel before coming to a smooth halt. Below me, the Atlantic crashed against the jagged shoreline, churning white foam into the dark, restless water. I shifted the transmission into park and killed the engine. The silence inside the cabin was sudden heavy and ringing with clarity. I reached into the structured leather bag resting on the passenger seat and pulled out my laptop. I rested it on the center console and flipped the lid open. The screen glowed to life, casting a cold blue light across my hands, washing out the pale skin of my knuckles. The role of the quiet mule was dead. The invisible shield I had placed around the Bailey family ego was officially withdrawn. They wanted to strip me of the legacy. They wanted to prove they were the undisputed masters of their universe standing at the top of the mountain. I stared at the blinking cursor on the login screen. It was a tiny, rhythmic pulse, mirroring the steady, calculated beat in my chest. My fingers hovered over the keys. 5 years of secret ledgers, holding companies, and backdoor equity clauses were neatly categorized in the encrypted servers beneath my fingertips. Every credit line, every vendor contract, every gallon of fuel powering their yachts was tethered to this single machine. I typed in my master password. The security firewall dissolved instantly, granting me unhindered access to the central nervous system of Bailey Maritime. The memory of Preston raising his glass of wine flashed through my mind one last time. "To trimming the dead weight," he had said, a smirk dancing in his eyes. A soft, genuine laugh escaped my throat, echoing in the quiet car. It was a sound devoid of warmth, smooth as polished ice. I opened the primary banking portal for the subsidiary. The screen displayed rows of black numbers representing the vast operational wealth they thought they commanded. Wealth I had generated through sleepless nights and calculated risks. It was time to grant their wish. It was time to leave them entirely to their own devices. I clicked on the administrative dashboard, bringing up the master control for the corporate accounts. The time for hiding behind shell companies and silent approvals was officially over. They had demanded a war without realizing they were fighting the person who owned the armory. The drive from the coastal docks to my high-rise in downtown Providence took exactly 40 minutes. I spent every second of that commute shedding the lingering, invisible weight of the Bailey family expectations. The historic mansions of Newport faded in my rearview mirror, replaced by the towering glass and steel structures of the city skyline. This was my true domain, a place built on modern efficiency and raw data, far removed from the rotting maritime aristocracy my parents clung to. I parked in my reserved underground spot and took the private elevator up to the penthouse. The doors slid open to reveal my sanctuary. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a sweeping, unhindered view of the Providence harbor. The aesthetic was deliberate. Clean lines, muted tones, minimalist architecture. There were no oil paintings of nautical ancestors staring down in judgment. There were no mahogany display cabinets housing empty accolades. Every single item in this space had been earned by my own hands. I walked straight to the kitchen island, dropping my keys onto the pristine white marble surface. The stone was cool under my fingertips, grounding me in the present moment. I opened my laptop again, setting it squarely in the center of the counter. The screen illuminated, casting a crisp glow across the darkened room. During the drive, I had decided exactly how I wanted to execute this transition of power. A sudden, total collapse would be too merciful. They needed to feel the foundation cracking beneath their feet before the walls actually caved in. They needed to experience the agonizing realization that their social currency was entirely counterfeit. I logged into the Oceanic Apex Solutions Master Financial Terminal. The interface loaded instantly, displaying the intricate web of accounts, subsidiaries, and holding structures I had meticulously woven over the past half-decade. I navigated to the specific branch labeled Bailey Maritime Operations. There they were, the lifelines of my family's unearned arrogance. I scrolled through the active ledgers. I saw the unlimited corporate expense account Preston used to charter private helicopters for weekend golf trips. I saw the elite-tier credit lines Virginia utilized to fund her high society luncheons and designer wardrobe. I saw the vendor payment channels that kept the Newport estate functioning, from the landscaping crew to the private chefs. My cursor hovered over the master authorization switch. This was the digital guillotine. It required no physical force. It required no shouting matches in a crowded boardroom. It only required a quiet, calculated decision to stop providing the oxygen they breathed. 3 keystrokes. That was all it took. I highlighted the primary operational funds and the secondary luxury accounts. I pressed the command key and hit execute. The screen refreshed. A green status bar briefly flashed across the interface before the dashboard updated. Every single account linked to Charles, Virginia, and Preston shifted from a vibrant, active status to a stark, glaring red label that read, suspended. The strike was flawless. The financial arteries were instantly severed. I stood in the quiet kitchen, letting the reality of the moment settle over me. I walked over to the espresso machine and began the meticulous process of brewing a dark roast. The grinding of the beans provided a comforting mechanical hum against the silence of the penthouse. Then the pebble dropped. A sudden fierce buzzing shattered the tranquility of the room. My phone, sitting flat against the marble counter, vibrated with such intensity it began to slowly inch across the polished stone. The harsh, rhythmic sound was jarring, contrasting sharply with the serene environment I had cultivated. I picked up my ceramic mug, took a slow sip of the bitter coffee, and walked over to the device. The caller identification flashed brightly on the screen. Virginia Bailey. I did not reach for it. I stood perfectly still, watching the screen glow and darken as the call went to voicemail. 10 seconds later, the buzzing resumed. This time, the name on the screen belonged to Charles. His call lasted the maximum duration, ringing relentlessly until the automated system cut him off. Almost immediately, the phone lit up a third time. Preston. The sequence of the callers told me everything I needed to know about the hierarchy of their panic. Virginia called first because her social reputation was currently imploding. Charles called second because he was furious that an administrative error was disrupting his afternoon. Preston called third because his fragile ego could not comprehend a world where a piece of plastic bearing his name was denied. I silenced the device, turning it face down on the marble. I did not need to speak to them to know exactly what was happening 30 miles away. I had a much better way of witnessing the fallout. I opened a new encrypted tab on my laptop and accessed the security surveillance network. 5 years ago, when I absorbed Bailey Maritime, I had insisted on upgrading the physical security of all corporate assets. Charles had praised the initiative, believing it was a necessary measure to protect his esteemed legacy. He never realized that, by designating the Newport estate as a secondary corporate office for tax purposes, he legally permitted me to install and monitor high-definition cameras at every entrance. I brought up the feed for the front gates of the Newport property. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the manicured driveway. A small fleet of pristine white catering vans was parked awkwardly near the main entrance. Virginia was scheduled to host one of her infamous twilight brunches today, an event designed exclusively to parade her perceived wealth in front of the local hospital board members. On the high-resolution feed, I watched the scene unfold with cinematic clarity. The head caterer, a stern-looking man holding an electronic payment terminal, stood on the front steps. Virginia stood opposite him, framed by the grand doorway. She was wearing a tailored silk dress, her posture rigid with indignation. I activated the external audio feed. The microphone picked up the crisp coastal wind and the tense exchange happening on the porch. "I assure you, madam, the terminal is functioning perfectly," the caterer said, his tone polite but firm. "The transaction has been declined by your financial institution, twice." Virginia let out a sharp, haughty scoff. Her hand fluttered nervously to her throat, a telltale sign of her internal panic. "This is entirely absurd. Do you have any idea who we are? There must be a glitch in your archaic little machine. My son runs a billion-dollar logistics firm. We do not have declined transactions." "I am reading the screen, Mrs. Baileyent," the man replied, refusing to back down. "We require the retainer to be paid in full before my staff can unload the chafing dishes and the floral arrangements." Virginia snatched the titanium card from the caterer's hand, her face flushing a deep, mottled pink. She scrambled to maintain her aristocratic facade, desperately searching for an excuse that would preserve her dignity. "It is the bank," Virginia declared, her voice shrill and defensive. "They are constantly freezing our accounts due to security protocols. We are dealing with a bothersome new property tax ordinance that the City Council is trying to force upon us. The accountants are moving vast sums of capital around to handle the municipal audits. It triggers these ridiculous fraud alerts." She was lying, effortlessly weaving a narrative of bureaucratic inconvenience to mask the terrifying reality of insufficient funds. It was a masterful performance, but the caterer remained unimpressed. "I understand," he said, retrieving his terminal. "However, corporate policy dictates we cannot render services without successful payment. We will pack up the vans." Virginia stood frozen on the steps, watching her carefully curated social event drive away down the gravel path. Her shoulders slumped, the illusion of her untouchable status cracking visibly in the afternoon light. I toggled the camera feeds, switching my view to the interior garage. Preston was pacing furiously next to his imported sports car. Even without audio, his body language screamed entitlement and frustration. He was jabbing his thumb into his smartphone screen, likely drafting the series of demanding text messages currently lighting up my silenced device. Preston possessed a fatal character flaw. He was pathologically incapable of looking inward. A competent executive, faced with a sudden corporate freeze, would immediately contact the accounting department, call the bank representatives, and review the daily ledgers to locate the discrepancy. Preston did none of those things. His arrogance shielded him from logic. He truly believed he was the master of the universe, and any obstacle in his path was merely an IT glitch, a minor annoyance caused by incompetent subordinates. Instead of investigating the root of the financial hemorrhage, Preston chose to cover the wound with a bandage woven from his own ego. He needed to prove to himself and to his new partner Nolan that his power was absolute. He needed to demonstrate that a declined card at a local catering company was beneath his notice. I opened the corporate email server, monitoring the outgoing traffic from his subsidiary address. A new message populated in the sent folder. It was a reservation confirmation. Preston had just booked the premier corner table at the Newport Harbor Yacht Club for dinner this evening. He had invited Nolan to a 5-course maritime feast, intending to flex his financial muscle and finalize whatever predatory deal they were cooking up in the shadows. He was marching straight toward a devastating public humiliation, determined to prove his wealth was untouchable. I closed the email client and closed the laptop. The quiet hum of the Providence traffic drifted up through the glass windows. Preston wanted to play the high-rolling tycoon in front of Rhode Island's elite. He wanted to sit in a room full of generational wealth and pretend he belonged at the head of the table. I walked toward my master bedroom, mentally scanning my wardrobe. If my brother was going to orchestrate his own spectacular social destruction, I was not going to watch it on a security feed. I was going to secure a front-row seat. The Newport Harbor Yacht Club requires a generational pedigree just to walk past the valet stand. The interior smells of polished teakwood, expensive gin, and roasted sea bass. I secured a corner booth draped in heavy shadows, allowing me an unobstructed view of the main dining floor. I wore a tailored charcoal blazer, blending into the dim ambient light of the brass table lamps. A chilled martini sat untouched in front of me, the olive resting quietly at the bottom of the glass. This club was a standing monument to Rhode Island aristocracy. For decades, Charles paraded our family through these double doors, demanding the finest window tables overlooking the docks. He wanted everyone to witness the unyielding strength of the Bailey dynasty. Growing up, I was instructed to sit straight, speak only when addressed, and maintain the illusion of a perfect, cohesive unit. Tonight, I was here to watch that exact illusion shatter into 1,000 unrecoverable pieces. Right on schedule, the maitre d' pulled back the velvet rope at the entrance. Preston strode into the room, carrying himself like a conquering king. He wore a bespoke navy suit that probably cost more than a dock worker's annual salary. Beside him walked Nolan. If my brother was a preening peacock, Nolan was a shark navigating a coral reef. The corporate liquidator wore a dark, sleek suit and moved with a predatory stillness. They were guided to a prime center table directly in my line of sight, but far enough away that I remained unnoticed. The waiter poured them generous glasses of an expensive vintage Bordeaux. I leaned back into the plush leather seating, tuning my focus to their conversation. The acoustics in the dining room carried voices remarkably well across the hardwood floors. Preston leaned across the white linen tablecloth, his voice booming with unearned confidence. He was trying desperately to impress his guest, overcompensating for the invisible administrative errors he thought he was facing. "Those invisible investors think they hold the reins," Preston boasted, swirling the dark red liquid in his glass. "They sit in some glass tower in Manhattan, crunching numbers, acting like they dictate my operational tempo. But they lack vision, Nolan. They lack the maritime pedigree. Today, I took the first step in crushing their influence. I shed the internal deadweight keeping this company anchored to the past. By next quarter, those faceless suits will be begging me to lead the buyout." I picked up my martini glass, letting the cold rim press against my lips. The gin burned a slow, steady trail down my throat. The irony was a physical sensation settling deep in my chest. Preston was painting a picture of an epic corporate rebellion against a phantom board of directors. He imagined himself a brilliant tactician outsmarting a room full of seasoned Wall Street veterans. He did not realize the faceless suits he planned to crush consisted entirely of his older sister, sitting 50 feet away sipping a cocktail. They feasted on seared scallops and dry-aged steaks. Preston continued his monologue, outlining grandiose plans for expansion, without mentioning a single realistic financial metric. Nolan listened intently, nodding at appropriate intervals, but his sharp eyes constantly evaluated his host. The predator was assessing the thickness of the prey's armor. Then came the moment of truth. The waiter approached their table carrying a slim black leather folder. He placed it discreetly next to Preston's empty wineglass. My brother did not even pause his story. He smoothly reached into his breast pocket, retrieved the titanium corporate card, and dropped it onto the leather without glancing at the total. The waiter nodded, picking up the folder and retreating toward the service station. I set my glass down. The waiting period felt like a suspended breath. In the background, a soft jazz piano played a meandering melody. 2 minutes passed, then 3. The waiter reappeared. He did not walk with his previous brisk efficiency. His steps were measured, cautious. He approached Preston's side and leaned down, coming in far closer than standard fine dining etiquette dictated. The pebble dropped. The waiter whispered a few hushed syllables into my brother's ear. Preston stopped mid-sentence. His jaw went slack. The confident posture he had maintained all evening vanished, replaced by a rigid defensive stiffness. Even in the dim lighting, I saw the dark flush of crimson creep up his neck, flooding his cheeks with humiliated color. "Run it again," Preston hissed, his voice losing its polished veneer. "It is a machine error. Run it again." The waiter maintained a painful, professional neutrality. "We have tried twice, sir. The merchant terminal indicates the account is frozen. Do you have an alternative method of payment?" Preston frantically dug into his wallet, pulling out a personal platinum card. He practically shoved it into the waiter's hand. The server retreated once more. I watched Nolan. The shark had stopped nodding. His posture shifted, leaning back into his chair, steepling his fingers. The illusion of Preston's infinite wealth was cracking right in front of him. A partner with a frozen corporate account is a liability. A partner with a declined personal account is a target. The waiter returned for the final time. The look on his face delivered the verdict before he even opened his mouth. The personal card tied directly to the luxury expense lines I had severed that afternoon had also failed. "I am terribly sorry, Mr. Bailey," the waiter murmured. "This card is also denying the transaction." The silence at their table was deafening. Preston stared at the leather folder as if it contained a live explosive. He had no cash. His digital lifelines were dead. He was sitting in the most exclusive room in Rhode Island, unable to purchase the steak he had just consumed. Nolan did not offer words of comfort. He smoothly extracted a sleek black card of his own and handed it to the waiter. "Put it on this," Nolan instructed, his tone dripping with quiet condescension. "And bring the receipt directly to me." The shift in power was instantaneous. Nolan had paid the tab. Nolan now owned the interaction. Preston shrank into his seat, his face a mask of mortification and simmering rage. As Nolan signed the receipt, Preston scanned the room, desperately seeking an outlet for his humiliation. He needed someone to blame. His eyes swept over the crowded tables, darting past local politicians and shipping magnates, until his gaze snagged on the shadowy corner booth. He saw me. I did not avert my eyes. I raised my martini glass in a silent mock toast. Preston stood up so fast his heavy oak chair scraped loudly against the hardwood floor, drawing irritated glances from neighboring diners. He muttered a terse excuse to Nolan and marched across the dining room. Each step was fueled by frantic, misdirected fury. He stopped at the edge of my table, gripping the brass railing so tightly his knuckles turned white. His breathing was shallow and ragged. "You did this," Preston snarled, keeping his voice low to avoid attracting the maitre d'. "I do not know how you accessed my routing numbers, but this is beyond a petty tantrum, Deborah. You are hacking a multi-million-dollar enterprise. You are committing cyber fraud because you are bitter I fired you." I let out a soft, genuine chuckle. He still thought he was the CEO. He still believed my retaliation was the desperate act of a disgruntled former employee typing code into a basement computer. He could not fathom that I did not hack the bank. I owned the bank. "You look flushed, Preston," I replied, keeping my tone perfectly conversational. Perhaps the vintage Bordeaux was a bit too robust for your palate. Or maybe you are just realizing that your entire life is funded by an allowance you no longer receive. His eyes narrowed into thin, dangerous slits. You think this is a game. You think you can embarrass me in front of my investors and walk away. You have no idea the forces you are dealing with. I am going to bury you. I am calling the family attorneys first thing tomorrow morning. I will drown you in injunctions. I will hit you with a lawsuit so devastating, you will be legally barred from stepping foot in this state. He leaned in closer, his breath smelling of expensive wine and cheap desperation. I am going to send a cease and desist that will make your head spin. You will surrender every piece of data you stole, or I will personally see you thrown in federal prison. Preston straightened his jacket, convinced he had delivered a lethal blow. He turned and stormed out of the dining room, leaving Nolan trailing behind him. I sat alone, in the dim corner booth, watching his retreating figure. My brother thought he was intimidating me. He thought the threat of legal warfare would send me running back to the shadows, begging for forgiveness. He did not understand the legal system. He did not understand that sending a formal lawyer to my door was exactly what I needed. By involving the attorneys, Preston was building the very bridge I planned to use to march my corporate reality right into their living room. He promised me a legal battle by morning. I took a final sip of my martini, letting the cold gin fortify my resolve. I could hardly wait for the courier to arrive. The morning sun crested over the Providence skyline, casting long, sharp shadows across the polished concrete floor of my corner office. I sat behind a vast desk constructed from a single slab of reclaimed maritime oak. The environment was a calculated departure from the dusty nautical nostalgia of the Newport estate. Here there were no oil paintings of ancient schooners or tarnished brass compasses. There were only floor-to-ceiling glass panels, streaming data metrics, and the quiet, relentless hum of modern efficiency. My general counsel, Nathan, sat in the leather armchair opposite my desk. He held a sleek tablet reviewing our corporate defense protocols. He was sharp, meticulous, and completely aware of the financial checkmate we had orchestrated the previous afternoon. The stage was set. We were simply waiting for the inevitable counterattack. The intercom on my desk chimed with a crisp electronic tone. My assistant informed me that a representative from my father's legal firm had arrived in the lobby, demanding an immediate audience. I smiled, gesturing for Nathan to remain seated. The response time was almost exactly what I had predicted. Preston had undoubtedly spent the entire night pacing his study drafting apocalyptic threats, while Charles mobilized the old guard. The heavy glass door swung open. Mr. Carmichael stepped into the room. Carmichael was a relic of a bygone era. He wore a heavy wool pinstripe suit, perfectly folded pocket square, and a grim expression of unearned superiority. For 30 years, his firm had handled the Bailey family trust, their real estate acquisitions, and their shipping contracts. He represented the entrenched arrogance of Rhode Island high society. He looked at me not as the titan of a $900 million holding company, but as the rebellious daughter of his most prestigious client. He did not offer a greeting. He walked straight to my oak desk and dropped a thick, cream-colored envelope onto the center of the wood. The document was sealed with a heavy dollop of crimson wax, pressed with the Bailey family crest. The archaic theatrics were classic Charles. He treated corporate disputes like feudal warfare, believing a wax seal imparted a sense of terrifying authority. To me, it just looked desperate. I did not reach for the envelope immediately. I let it sit there, forcing Carmichael to stand in the awkward silence. The grandfather clock in the corner ticked a steady rhythmic pulse against the quiet tension of the room. I am delivering this formal cease and desist on behalf of your father and the executive board of Bailey Maritime Carmichael, announced his voice dripping with condescension. You are instructed to immediately halt all cyber interference with their operational networks. If you fail to restore their digital banking access within the hour, we will file an emergency injunction. We will bring federal extortion charges against you, Deborah. Your father is willing to be lenient and keep this out of the press if you stop this juvenile vandalism right now. I picked up a silver letter opener and sliced cleanly through the crimson wax. I unfolded the heavy parchment. The legal jargon was dense, aggressive, and entirely baseless. They accused me of corporate sabotage, illegal wire fraud, and malicious interference with a multinational supply chain. This was the moment. The trap required a very specific type of bait. I let my shoulders drop. I widened my eyes, allowing a flicker of manufactured terror to cross my face. I looked up at Nathan, my breathing intentionally shallow. "Nathan, this is a federal threat," I whispered, letting my voice tremble just enough to sound convincing. "They are alleging cyberwire fraud. Charles is bringing the full weight of the estate and the legal system down on us. We cannot fight a federal injunction. The legal fees alone would bankrupt my personal accounts. We have to retreat." Carmichael puffed his chest out, his posture relaxing into a smug, victorious stance. He believed he had just crushed a rebellious child with a single piece of paper. He thought the mere mention of a federal courtroom had broken my resolve. "Are you advising a full surrender?" Deborah Nathan asked, playing his part flawlessly. I looked back down at the parchment, my hands putting on a brilliant performance of trembling anxiety. "I want it on the official record, Mr. Carmichael," I said, my voice tight. "I am formally ceasing all operational contact with Bailey Maritime. I am stepping away from their internal network. I am retreating. Please inform my father and my brother that I will no longer interfere with their subsidiary operations as of this exact minute. Do you understand?" "I understand completely," Carmichael replied, a cruel, satisfied smirk spreading across his wrinkled face. "It is wise of you to finally recognize your place. I will inform Charles that you have surrendered your hostile position." The performance was over. The legal bait had been swallowed whole. In corporate litigation, establishing a documented retreat is the ultimate defensive maneuver. By forcing the opposing counsel to witness and accept my formal surrender, I had just immunized myself. If Preston took any further aggressive action against my holding company after this exact moment, he could no longer claim self-defense. Any hostile move he made now would be categorized as unprovoked malice and a direct breach of his fiduciary duty. I had just built a bulletproof legal casing for his eventual termination. The trembling in my hands vanished instantly. My spine straightened. The manufactured panic drained from my features, replaced by a mask of pure, unadulterated ice. "Since I am officially stepping back from interfering with the subsidiary level," I continued, my voice dropping to a smooth, chilling register, "I will now be operating strictly from my capacity as the parent holding entity." Carmichael frowned, his smug expression faltering. "The parent entity? What are you talking about?" I opened the top drawer of my desk. I retrieved a thick black leather binder and slid it smoothly across the oak surface until it rested right next to the shattered crimson wax of his ridiculous envelope. "I suggest you review those documents, Mr. Carmichael. Since you are representing the subsidiary, you should probably familiarize yourself with the actual ownership structure of the harbor." Carmichael cast a suspicious glance at Nathan before reaching for the binder. He flipped open the cover. The first document was the unredacted buyout agreement from 5 years ago, detailing the exact purchase of the bankrupt Bailey fleet. The second document was the corporate capitalization table. The third was the master deed to the Newport estate, the shipping yards, and every single vessel currently floating under the Bailey flag. I watched his eyes dart back and forth across the crisp legal text. The color drained from his face at an alarming rate, shifting from a ruddy pink to a sickly, translucent gray. A faint sheen of cold sweat broke out across his forehead. His breathing hitched. He read the name of the holding company that owned every asset his clients claimed to control: Oceanic Apex Solutions. Then he read the name of the sole unencumbered majority shareholder, Deborah Bailey. He flipped the page, his hands now shaking with genuine, unmanufactured terror. He was looking at the irrefutable proof that the faceless private equity board Preston feared was sitting right across from him. "You," Carmichael stammered, his voice reduced to a hollow, breathless rasp. "You bought the debt. You own the holding company." "I own the holding company, the ships, the payroll, and the very desk my father sits behind when he signs your retainer checks," I clarified, leaning forward, resting my elbows on the oak. "You just marched into my office and handed a hostile legal threat to the woman who owns 100% of your client's equity. You just threatened to sue the apex predator on behalf of the prey." Carmichael dropped the binder as if the leather had suddenly caught fire. He took a stumbling step backward, bumping into the arm of the leather chair. His mind was struggling to process the catastrophic error he had just committed. He had walked in, expecting to bully a rogue employee. He was walking out, realizing he had just declared war on a sovereign corporate power. "What do you want me to do?" he whispered, pulling a handkerchief from his pocket to dab at his forehead. "I want you to go back to Newport," I instructed, my tone laced with absolute authority. "I want you to explain to Charles and Preston that they are running a phantom branch of my empire. But do it slowly, Mr. Carmichael. I want them to savor the realization that their entire reality is a lease I am preparing to terminate." Carmichael did not say another word. He turned and practically fled from the office, the heavy glass door swinging shut behind his retreating figure. Nathan chuckled quietly from his armchair, picking up his tablet. "Well, that handles the legal flank. They cannot file an injunction against the entity that literally owns their charter. The courtroom route is entirely dead for them." I looked out the window at the bustling Providence harbor below. Nathan was right. The cease and desist was a desperate opening volley, and it had exploded in their faces. Charles would spend the rest of the day reeling from the shock of the master deed, realizing his boardroom ambush had cost him his entire kingdom. But I knew my mother. Virginia Bailey did not care about corporate structuring or capitalization tables. She cared about perception. She cared about her standing in the gilded halls of Rhode Island high society. If her husband and her golden son could not defeat me with lawyers and contracts, she would pivot to the only battlefield she truly understood. She could not win in the boardroom, so she would attempt to destroy me in the court of public opinion. She would try to poison my name among the elite before the truth about the buyout became public knowledge. She was going to weaponize the charity circuit. I turned back to my desk, checking my digital calendar. The annual Rhode Island Healthcare Foundation luncheon was scheduled for tomorrow afternoon. Virginia was the keynote hostess. It was time to select a very sharp suit. The Rosecliff Mansion in Newport is a sprawling architectural testament to the Gilded Age. Its limestone facade and manicured French gardens have hosted the state's most exclusive social events for over a century. Today, it was the battleground my mother had chosen. The annual Rhode Island Healthcare Foundation luncheon was Virginia Bailey's crown jewel. It was her opportunity to gather the wives of politicians, shipping magnates, and hospital administrators into one room to consolidate her social power. I parked my car near the sprawling front gates. The ocean breeze carried the faint scent of blooming hydrangeas and expensive perfume. I checked my reflection in the rearview mirror. I wore a tailored navy suit, sharp enough to draw blood. My hair was pulled back into a severe knot. There was no softness in my appearance today. I was not attending as a daughter seeking reconciliation. I was attending as an executioner. Walking up the grand marble staircase, I could hear the muted hum of 300 influential women engaged in polite conversation. Virginia did not know the corporate truth yet. Charles had undoubtedly shielded her from the contents of the master deed, preferring to handle the disaster privately before admitting defeat to his wife. So she had proceeded with her own offensive strategy. If she could not control me with parental authority, she would attempt to control my narrative. The heavy mahogany doors to the grand ballroom stood open. I slipped in unnoticed, blending into the shadows near the rear exit. The room was a sea of pastel dresses, floral centerpieces, and crystal champagne flutes. At the head table, sitting beneath a massive crystal chandelier, Virginia held court. She was in her element. Her posture was impeccable, her smile radiant, but I knew the exact cadence of her voice when she was spreading poison. I slowly edged my way closer, weaving through the peripheral tables until I was within earshot of her inner circle. "It is just a tragic situation," Virginia murmured, dabbing the corner of her eye with a linen napkin. "We gave Deborah every opportunity to succeed within the family structure, but you know how sibling rivalry can fester. She became completely unhinged when Charles promoted Preston. She has been making these wild, delusional threats, claiming she is going to extort the company. Preston is handling it with such grace, but it breaks a mother's heart to see her daughter spiral into such instability." The women at the table offered sympathetic nods and dramatic sighs. They were eagerly absorbing the narrative Virginia was spinning. By painting me as a jealous, unstable extortionist, she was preemptively destroying my credibility. If I tried to speak the truth later, the high society echo chamber would simply dismiss me as a bitter outcast. She was weaponizing her social network to bury me alive. The director of the Healthcare Foundation, a formidable woman named Eleanor, approached the podium to signal the beginning of the formal program. Eleanor tapped the microphone, requesting the room's attention. The polite chatter subsided, replaced by the soft clinking of silver forks against fine china. "Thank you all for gathering today," Eleanor began, her voice echoing through the opulent ballroom. "As you know, this foundation relies on the incredible generosity of Rhode Island's private sector. Today, we are gathered to announce the funding for the new pediatric wing at the Coastal Medical Center." This was my cue. I stepped out from the shadows and began walking down the center aisle. My heels clicked a slow, deliberate rhythm against the polished hardwood floor. The sound cut through the quiet ballroom, drawing eyes toward me. Whispers rippled through the crowd as the attendees recognized the subject of Virginia's recent tragic monologue. Virginia saw me halfway down the aisle. The radiant smile vanished from her face, instantly replaced by a flash of genuine panic. She gripped the edge of the head table, her knuckles turning white. She clearly expected me to cause a scene, to shout accusations, or throw a glass of champagne. She expected a display of the instability she had just finished describing. I did none of those things. I maintained a perfectly neutral expression, projecting calm, calculated authority. I reached the front of the room, bypassing my mother's table entirely. I walked directly up the small set of stairs and approached the podium. Eleanor looked startled, unsure of protocol, but I offered her a polite, reassuring nod. "Excuse me, Eleanor," I said, my voice carrying clearly through the microphone. "I apologize for the interruption, but I wanted to ensure this donation was delivered personally." The ballroom descended into absolute pin-drop silence. 300 pairs of eyes were fixed on me. The clinking of silverware stopped completely. The quiet was heavy, expectant. I reached into the inner pocket of my navy blazer and withdrew a crisp, white envelope. I handed it to Eleanor. She opened the flap, pulling out the cashier's check. Her eyes widened, scanning the amount and the issuing entity. She looked from the paper to me, her professional composure momentarily fracturing. "This is Eleanor," stammered, leaning closer to the microphone. "This is a $1 million contribution." A collective gasp echoed through the room. $1 million was a staggering sum even for this crowd. But the amount was not the most devastating piece of information. From Oceanic Apex Solutions, Eleanor continued reading the printed text on the check aloud. The name of the holding company hung in the air like a physical weight. Every influential woman in that room knew exactly what Oceanic Apex Solutions was. It was the marine biotech giant that dominated the state economy. More importantly, it was the exact company Virginia had spent the last 5 years boasting that her brilliant son Preston owned and operated. Virginia stood up her chair, scraping loudly against the floorboards. "Deborah, what are you doing?" she hissed, her voice tight with barely suppressed rage. "You have no authority to distribute corporate funds on Preston's behalf. This is a stunt." I turned slowly to face her, resting my hands lightly on the edges of the podium. I did not look angry. I looked mildly amused. "I am not distributing funds on Preston's behalf, Mother," I replied, my voice smooth and carrying effortlessly through the speakers. "Preston is a regional manager for a defunct subsidiary. He has a $0 signing authority. I am the sole owner and chief executive officer of Oceanic Apex Solutions. I authorize this donation because the pediatric wing aligns with my corporate philanthropic strategy." The silence that followed was total and absolute. The elite crowd connected the dots in real time. The brilliant narrative Virginia had spun over the past 5 years unraveled completely. The women at her table, the same women who had just offered her their sympathetic nods, now stared at her with a mixture of shock and dawning comprehension. They realized Virginia was not the matriarch of a billion-dollar empire. She was the mother of a fraud. And the daughter she had just labeled as an unstable extortionist was the invisible titan funding their entire social ecosystem. Virginia's smear campaign crumbled into dust right in front of her eyes. Her social standing, the only currency she truly valued, evaporated in an instant. She stood frozen at the head table, her face pale, her mouth opening and closing without producing a sound. She was publicly exposed, humiliated, and stripped of her power by the very daughter she had tried to bury. I turned back to Eleanor, offering a polite, professional smile. "Thank you for your continued work in the community, Eleanor. Please ensure the funds are allocated directly to the neonatal intensive care unit." I stepped away from the podium and walked back down the center aisle. The crowd parted for me, the whispers now replaced by stunned silence. I did not look back at my mother. I walked out of the Rosecliff mansion, leaving the heavy mahogany doors open behind me. The societal flank had been neutralized. Virginia would spend the next decade trying to repair the damage to her reputation. But as I walked back to my car, I knew this battle was far from over. Cornered animals are unpredictable. Preston had been humiliated at the yacht club. Virginia had been destroyed at the charity luncheon. Charles was sitting on a master deed that proved his kingdom was a mirage. They were out of options and out of time, which meant Preston was about to do something incredibly stupid. Desperate to regain control of a narrative slipping rapidly through his fingers, he would attempt to bypass my authority entirely. He would try to force a transaction that he believed would secure his independence, not realizing he was about to cross the line from corporate incompetence directly into federal crime. The family drama was over. The corporate thriller was about to begin. The aftermath of the Rosecliff Mansion charity luncheon was a masterclass in deafening silence. My phone, which had been vibrating with manic energy just hours prior, now sat completely still on the passenger seat of my car. Virginia had been neutralized. Her carefully constructed social narrative had been publicly dismantled, leaving her isolated in the wreckage of her own arrogance. But I knew the Baileys. Defeat in one arena simply meant a panicked retreat to another. Charles would attempt to leverage legal channels, which Carmichael had already proven useless. That left Preston, my golden brother, the fraudulent chief executive, the man who poured vintage wine to celebrate my exile. He was cornered. His corporate cards were declining. His personal wealth was suddenly inaccessible. His new partner, Nolan the Shark, was circling, demanding answers. Desperation breeds stupidity, and Preston was arguably the most desperate man in Rhode Island. I drove back to my Providence high-rise, the adrenaline of the public confrontation slowly fading into a sharp, calculated focus. The family drama phase of this operation was over. The societal humiliation was a necessary precursor, but it was not the ultimate objective. The true battleground was financial. It was time to transition from daughter to auditor. I entered my penthouse bypassing the kitchen and walking straight into my home office. The room was dark save for the ambient glow of the city skyline piercing through the glass panels. I woke up my primary workstation. The multiple monitors flared to life, displaying the complex architecture of the Oceanic Apex Solutions network. It was time to examine the frozen accounts of Bailey Maritime. For 5 years, I had allowed Preston a significant degree of operational autonomy. It was a calculated risk. I needed the illusion of his leadership to be convincing enough to satisfy Charles and blind Preston to his own irrelevance. I had monitored the broad financial strokes, ensuring the subsidiary remained profitable, but I had rarely dug into the granular line items of his daily expenses. That leniency ended yesterday. I accessed the central ledger, pulling the unredacted transaction history for the past fiscal quarter. The data scrolled across the screens, a continuous stream of numerical arrogance. I began filtering the results, isolating the expenditures authorized directly by Preston under his executive mandate. The sheer volume of waste was staggering but not surprising. There were exorbitant charges for luxury hotel suites, private car services, and country club memberships, all billed under the guise of client acquisition and corporate networking. It was standard gross mismanagement, the kind of bloated spending that destroys legacy companies but rarely results in federal prosecution. I was not looking for mismanagement. I was looking for fraud. 6 months ago, I had quietly instituted a new compliance protocol within the Oceanic Apex financial framework. It required all subsidiary executives to provide explicit digital documentation and secondary verification for any transaction exceeding a specific threshold categorized under research and development. It was a standard corporate safeguard. I also knew Preston intimately. He viewed compliance protocols as bureaucratic obstacles designed for lesser employees. He possessed an unshakable belief that his title exempted him from scrutiny. I knew he would arrogantly bypass the new system, assuming his invisible private equity board would rubber stamp his genius. I had baited the trap. Now it was time to see what he had caught. I applied the compliance filter, cross-referencing Preston's authorized expenditures against the unverified research and development ledger. The system processed the query. The screen refreshed, presenting a condensed list of transactions that had bypassed the secondary verification protocol. The first entry caught my eye immediately. It was a charge from an elite wine merchant in Newport. The amount was precisely $5,000. The line item description submitted by Preston read, "Maritime Medical Research Supplies." I leaned closer to the monitor, the blue light reflecting in my eyes. The pebble dropped. It was the Chateau Petrus, the exact bottle of vintage wine he had poured in the boardroom to toast my exile. The vintage wine he had used to celebrate trimming the dead weight. He had not just expensed a personal luxury item, he had actively falsified a corporate document classifying an alcoholic beverage as medical research to bypass the newly instituted compliance threshold. In the eyes of the Securities and Exchange Commission, this was no longer a case of a spoiled heir misusing company funds. By falsifying the classification to evade a documented compliance protocol, Preston had crossed the legal threshold from gross negligence into active embezzlement. I continued scrolling down the filtered list. The Chateau Petrus was not an isolated incident. It was merely the tip of a terrifying, fraudulent iceberg. There were invoices for custom Italian leather upholstery billed as ergonomic bridge seating. There were charges for chartered flights to the Caribbean, categorized as logistical route surveying. The most damning entry was a staggering six-figure wire transfer to a private shell corporation listed as a consultation fee for marine biotech advancements. I ran a rapid trace on the receiving shell. It was registered to a holding company controlled by Preston. He was actively siphoning liquid capital out of the subsidiary and funneling it into private accounts. He was stealing from the very company he thought he owned. The magnitude of his stupidity was breathtaking. The evidence was irrefutable. I had the digital footprint, the falsified ledgers, and the unauthorized wire transfers all preserved within the encrypted servers of Oceanic Apex. I leaned back in my chair, running a hand through my hair. The implications were massive. This was no longer just about establishing sovereignty or severing toxic family ties. I was the legal owner of this subsidiary. If the federal authorities discovered this embezzlement independently, Oceanic Apex could be subjected to a devastating financial audit. My own assets could be entangled in a messy federal fraud investigation. I had to excise the cancer before it metastasized into the parent company. But Preston was not acting alone in his desperation. The timing of this aggressive siphoning aligned perfectly with the sudden arrival of Nolan. The corporate shark was not just a slick new partner. He was a catalyst. I accessed the encrypted communications portal, reviewing the internal emails Preston had sent from his executive account over the past 48 hours. The pieces snapped into place, forming a horrifying, cohesive picture. Preston was terrified. The frozen accounts had spooked him. The humiliation at the yacht club had shattered his illusion of invulnerability. He knew the phantom investors he believed he answered to were tightening the leash. He realized his embezzlement scheme was on the verge of being discovered by the very board he thought he had manipulated. He was trying to cash out before the house of cards collapsed. He was actively attempting to sell Bailey Maritime to Nolan's firm. He was trying to push through a massive hostile buyout, transferring the assets and the liabilities to the liquidator, hoping to pocket the purchase price and disappear before the invisible investors realized the company had been stolen. He was trying to sell a house he did not own. An alert flashed in the corner of my right monitor. It was an automated notification from the Bailey Maritime corporate calendar. Preston had just scheduled an emergency executive board meeting for 10 o'clock tomorrow morning. The agenda was listed as a mandatory vote on strategic acquisition and corporate restructuring. He was going to attempt to force the sale to Nolan. He was planning to stand in that mahogany boardroom and illegally sign away my assets. I stared at the blinking calendar notification. Preston was walking directly to the gallows, completely unaware that I was the one holding the rope. The stakes had skyrocketed, from family pride to federal fraud, and my golden brother had just handed me the execution warrant. I picked up my phone and dialed Nathan's secure line. He answered on the first ring, his voice crisp despite the late hour. "We have a situation, Nathan." I said, my tone flat and unwavering. "Preston is embezzling. I have the documented proof. Falsified ledgers, unauthorized wire transfers, the entire package. He is attempting to force an illegal sale of the subsidiary to Nolan's firm tomorrow morning to cover his tracks." There was a brief, heavy silence on the other end of the line. The legal implications were clear to both of us. "Do you want me to file the termination paperwork tonight?" Nathan asked, his voice shifting into immediate tactical mode. "We can have federal marshals at the Newport estate by dawn." "No," I replied, watching the city lights flicker outside my window. "We are not filing anything tonight. Let him hold his emergency meeting. Let him bring Nolan into that boardroom. Let him attempt to sell my empire. I am going to dial into that meeting, Nathan. I am going to let him present his fraudulent victory. And then I am going to project the real organizational chart onto the screens. I want Nolan to understand exactly what kind of liability he almost purchased. I want Preston to look the apex predator in the eye when his world ends. I hung up the phone. The true corporate execution was set for tomorrow morning. The digital clock on my secondary monitor clicked to 9:58. The morning sky outside my Providence penthouse was a flat, slate gray, casting a cool, clinical light across my workstation. Nathan sat adjacent to me, his fingers flying silently across a mechanical keyboard. We had established a backdoor connection to the Bailey Maritime Audio-Visual Network 3 hours prior. The secure feed provided a crystal-clear view of the Newport boardroom. I watched the players take their positions. Preston was pacing near the windows overlooking the harbor. Despite the climate-controlled environment, a faint sheen of sweat coated his forehead. He kept adjusting his silk tie, his movements jerky and uncoordinated. The illusion of the confident executive was fracturing under the weight of his own embezzlement. Charles sat at the head of the long mahogany table. He projected an aura of seasoned authority, resting his hands on the polished wood. My father believed he was presiding over a difficult but necessary strategic pivot. He had no idea his son was preparing to illegally liquidate the family legacy to cover a trail of fraudulent wire transfers. Nolan occupied the seat directly to Charles' right. The corporate shark looked entirely at ease. He wore a charcoal suit that absorbed the light, sitting with the terrifying stillness of a predator waiting for the prey to bleed out. A thick leather portfolio rested unopened in front of him. He was ready to carve up the carcass. At exactly 10 o'clock, Preston cleared his throat and took his seat. He tapped a gold pen against a stack of printed contracts. He began speaking, outlining the proposed acquisition. His voice carried a thin, desperate pitch. He talked about leveraging synergies and offloading operational liabilities to streamline their core maritime focus. He was using empty business jargon to mask theft. He claimed Nolan's firm was offering a generous cash injection that would secure their financial independence from the anonymous private equity board. I nodded to Nathan. The time for observation was over. Inside the Newport boardroom, the enormous display monitor mounted on the far wall abruptly flared to life. Preston's presentation vanished, replaced by a high-definition broadcast of my face. The reaction was instantaneous. Charles jerked backward, his chair groaning under his weight. Nolan narrowed his eyes, his predatory stillness breaking for a fraction of a second. Preston dropped his gold pen. It clattered loudly against the wood. "What is this?" Preston demanded, his voice cracking. He scrambled out of his chair, grabbing the remote control from the center console. He pointed it at the screen, jabbing his thumb repeatedly against the disconnect button. When the display remained active, he lunged toward the manual wall panel, slapping the power switch. The screen did not darken. My connection remained flawless. "Please return to your seat, Preston," I instructed. My voice resonated through the state-of-the-art surround sound speakers, filling the room with calm, undeniable authority. "Your hardware is currently locked. You cannot terminate this broadcast, and you cannot mute the audio. We have official corporate business to discuss." Charles found his voice, his face flushing a deep, angry crimson. "Deborah, this is a closed executive session. You were officially removed from this facility yesterday. Hacking into our private communications is a federal offense. I am terminating this feed right now. You are welcome to try, Charles," I replied, keeping my expression perfectly neutral. "But before you call the authorities, you might want to look at the document I am broadcasting to your personal tablets." Nathan executed the command. A synchronized chime echoed through the boardroom as the 3 digital devices resting on the table illuminated. I split the video feed on the main monitor, projecting a pristine, unredacted organizational chart of Oceanic Apex Solutions. The graphic was simple and devastating. At the very top, the parent holding company sat isolated and supreme. Below it, a web of lucrative marine biotech and healthcare logistics branches spread outward. Buried at the bottom, nestled underneath a strict compliance oversight division, was a tiny, insignificant box labeled Bailey Maritime Operations. Preston stared at his tablet. The color drained from his face, leaving him looking pale and sickly. "Allow me to clarify the corporate hierarchy for our guest," I continued, turning my gaze directly toward Nolan's camera feed. "You are currently attempting to purchase a company from a man who possesses zero equity. Preston is not a chief executive officer. According to the state registry, he is classified as a mid-level regional manager for a defunct subsidiary. He has no voting rights. He has no legal authority to transfer assets. He is quite literally trying to sell you a stolen bicycle." The silence in the boardroom was total. Charles picked up his tablet on his hands, trembling. He traced the lines of the organizational chart, his eyes widening, as he read my name, listed as the sole proprietor of the parent entity. The reality of his situation was finally penetrating decades of arrogant delusion. Then came the pebble. A sharp, distinct crack echoed through the room. Nolan had gripped his expensive fountain pen with such intense, sudden force that the resin casing snapped perfectly in half. Dark ink spilled over his knuckles, staining his pristine white cuff. He did not look at the mess. He looked directly at Preston. "You told me you held the majority voting shares," Nolan said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous register. "You provided financial statements indicating autonomous control of the fleet." "Those statements were falsified, Nolan," I interjected, drawing the shark's attention back to the screen. "Preston altered the internal ledgers because he is currently trying to hide a massive embezzlement scheme from my compliance division. He needed your cash to replace the capital he siphoned into his private shell accounts." Preston stammered, taking a step backward away from the table. "That is a lie. She is fabricating this data, Nolan. The deal is still good. We can sign the transfer right now." I smiled, a cold, practiced expression. "The deal is dead, Preston. And honestly, Nolan should be thanking me, because if he had signed that contract, he would be facing a federal indictment for purchasing stolen assets." I paused, letting the weight of the threat settle over the room. I had researched Nolan's firm extensively the night before. I knew exactly what kind of scavenger he was. "Although I doubt federal court scares you, Nolan," I added, leaning forward. "I know exactly what your boutique firm actually does. You are not a private equity investor. You are a corporate liquidator. A vulture." Charles whipped his head toward the guest, his confusion morphing into fresh horror. "A liquidator? He targets distressed companies." "Charles," I explained, speaking slowly to ensure my father understood the depth of his son's failure. "He offered Preston a fraction of the actual valuation. His business model is simple. He acquires the debt loads the company with toxic liabilities, strips the physical assets for parts, and files for bankruptcy. He was going to sell your historic fleet for scrap metal. Then he was going to leave you and Preston holding the bag for the resulting tax evasion penalties." Nolan stood up slowly. He dropped the broken halves of his pen onto the table. He did not attempt to defend himself. He was a professional predator, and he knew when a hunt was over. He wiped the ink from his hand using a linen napkin, his face a mask of cold fury. "You wasted my time," Preston Nolan stated, his tone devoid of any emotion. "That is a mistake you will deeply regret." Nolan picked up his leather portfolio and walked out of the boardroom without another word. The heavy doors shut behind him, sealing Charles and Preston inside their own personal nightmare. The illusion was gone. The golden child was exposed as a fraudulent thief who had nearly handed their entire legacy to a scavenger. The proud patriarch was staring at the digital proof that his discarded daughter owned the roof over his head. Preston collapsed into a chair, burying his face in his hands. He was hyperventilating the reality of his impending federal fraud charges, crushing his fragile ego into dust. I watched Charles, The anger that usually defined his interactions with me was missing. The booming voice of the Rhode Island shipping magnate had vanished. He looked old. He looked terrified. He realized that the boardroom ambush yesterday had cost him his kingdom. He realized that I held the keys to his survival. The shift in his demeanor was sickening to witness. The dictator evaporated, replaced instantly by a manipulative, pleading patriarch. He needed to reassert control, and he knew threats would no longer work. Deborah Charles said, his voice trembling, adopting a soft paternal tone I had not heard in 2 decades. This is a misunderstanding. Preston made some foolish mistakes, but we can fix this. You are brilliant. You built something incredible here. We are a family. We need to sit down and discuss this properly. I stared at the man who had ordered my removal just 24 hours ago. He was preparing to leverage decades of parental conditioning to guilt me into surrendering my sovereignty. I am coming to your office. Charles promised, his eyes locked on the camera lens. We are going to work this out as a family. I will be there in an hour. He thought proximity would give him an advantage. He thought he could walk into my sanctuary and weave a web of paternal obligation. He had no idea I was ready to sever that final thread. I tapped a key on my terminal, terminating the connection. The screen went dark. The true psychological warfare was about to begin. Exactly 52 minutes after the video feed terminated, the private elevator chimed in the reception area of my Providence headquarters. I stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, watching the gray churning waters of the harbor below. I did not need my assistant to announce the visitor over the intercom. The heavy, measured footsteps sinking into the plush corridor carpet belonged to a man who had spent 60 years expecting the world to part ways for him. The glass door to my executive suite swung open. Charles Bailey stepped inside. Seeing the patriarch of the Bailey dynasty stripped of his Newport mahogany backdrop was a jarring experience. He was wearing his signature tailored charcoal suit, but the fabric seemed to hang loosely around his shoulders. The unyielding maritime dictator who had ordered my physical removal from the family company yesterday was entirely gone. In his place stood an aging man, attempting to navigate a room where he held zero actual authority. In his hands he carried the most pathetic olive branch I had ever witnessed. 2 disposable cardboard cups of premium coffee. The sight of the steaming cups almost made me laugh. Yesterday he was popping vintage champagne to celebrate my exile from the family legacy. Today, he was carrying a $12 caffeinated beverage into my sanctuary, hoping to bribe the apex predator with roasted beans and steamed milk. He approached the reclaimed oak desk and placed one of the cups gently on the polished surface, sliding it toward my side. He took a seat in the leather armchair without waiting for an invitation. He looked around the pristine office, his eyes darting across the digital metric boards and the minimalist architecture. He was desperately searching for familiar ground, for an angle he could exploit. Finding none, he settled his gaze on me and deployed a weapon I had not seen him use in decades, a soft, paternal smile. Deborah. He began his voice, carrying a warm, gentle cadence that sent a visceral chill down my spine. I know tensions are running high. Yesterday was a terrible mistake, a profound misunderstanding fueled by poor communication and high-stakes stress. I brought you a vanilla latte. I remembered it was your favorite during those late nights you spent studying in college. I did not touch the cardboard cup. The steam spiraled upward, dissipating into the cool climate-controlled air of the office. He was trying to rewrite history. He was attempting to scrub away the cruelty of the past 5 years by offering a nostalgic anecdote that was entirely fabricated. I drank black coffee. I always drank black coffee. The vanilla latte belonged to Preston. Charles could not even correctly identify my preferences while groveling for his financial survival. We are a family. Charles continued leaning forward, resting his elbows on his knees to project earnest vulnerability. Families fight. Sometimes they say things they regret in the heat of the moment. Preston is young and impulsive. He lacks your brilliant strategic mind. I see that clearly now. You have built something genuinely magnificent here. But we need to protect the family name. We cannot let a temporary feud destroy generations of maritime history. Unfreeze the operational accounts, Deborah. Come back to the table. We can integrate your holding company properly and run this empire together as a unified front. The sweet, artificial scent of the vanilla syrup wafted across the desk. The aroma was cloying, thick, and suffocating. It acted as an involuntary catalyst, dragging my mind backward through time. 14 years ago, I was an 18-year-old girl standing in the drafty archives of the old Bailey warehouse. The winter air was biting, leaking through the poorly insulated window panes. I had spent 6 months analyzing our shipping manifests, identifying a staggering inefficiency in our coastal routing schedules. I had compiled a dense, meticulously researched binder proposing a full logistical overhaul that would save the fleet millions in wasted fuel and docking fees. I remembered walking into Charles' office, clutching that binder tightly against my chest. My heart was hammering with the naive, desperate hope of a daughter seeking her father's validation. I laid the proposal on his desk, explaining the math, pointing out the exact systemic failures dragging the company downward. I wanted him to see my potential. I wanted him to recognize that I was a valuable asset to the legacy. Charles had not even opened the cover. He had taken a sip of his scotch, stood up, and walked around the desk. He placed a heavy, patronizing hand on top of my head, patting my hair as if I were a golden retriever who had fetched a stick. "That is a very cute school project," he had said, his voice dripping with condescending amusement. "But the ocean is an unforgiving place. Leave the harbor to the men, Debbie. Run along and help your mother with the gala seating arrangements." The memory faded, replaced by the stark reality of the present. I looked at the man sitting across from me. He was pleading for the exact same harbor he had banned me from. He was begging for a lifeline from the cute school project he had dismissed without a second glance. I leaned forward, resting my forearms on the oak surface, bringing myself closer to his fabricated, earnest expression. "You do not get to invoke the concept of family duty, Charles," I said, my voice low and entirely devoid of warmth. "Family duty is a reciprocal agreement. It requires mutual protection and respect. You burned that bridge to ash a long time ago." Charles blinked, the soft paternal mask slipping for a fraction of a second. "Deborah, be reasonable." "I am being entirely reasonable," I countered, cutting off his objection. "Yesterday, you sat at the head of a boardroom and ordered a stranger to physically escort me off the premises. You sat in silence while Preston poured a $5,000 bottle of wine to celebrate trimming the dead weight. You thought you were removing a nuisance. You had no problem sacrificing your daughter to protect the fragile ego of an incompetent son." I picked up the cardboard coffee cup using the tips of my fingers and slid it slowly back across the desk until it bumped against his hand. "You did not come here to apologize," I continued, locking my eyes onto his terrified gaze. "You came here because your bank accounts are locked and you are facing total public ruin. You came here because you realized the regional manager you appointed is a thief who was hours away from selling your legacy to a liquidator. You have nothing left to negotiate with. The empire belongs to me. The equity is mine. The decisions are mine. We will never be a unified front." Charles stared at the rejected cup of coffee. The last remnants of his dictatorial pride drained from his body. His shoulders slumped forward, utterly defeated by the crushing weight of his own hubris. He had played every card in his deck. He had attempted intimidation, legal threats, and emotional manipulation. Every single strategy had shattered against the impenetrable fortress I had built. He stood up slowly, his movements stiff and lethargic. He did not offer another plea. He did not issue a parting threat. He simply turned around and walked toward the heavy glass door, leaving the unacknowledged coffee rapidly cooling on the reclaimed oak. The door clicked shut behind him, sealing his fate. I sat back in my chair, letting a deep breath fill my lungs. The patriarch was broken. The society matriarch was publicly disgraced. The fraudulent brother was paralyzed by the looming threat of a federal audit. The Bailey dynasty was officially dismantled. A quiet sense of finality washed over me. I reached for my encrypted tablet, ready to finalize the termination protocols for the Newport subsidiary branch. But the ocean is a treacherous environment. When a towering vessel sinks, it creates a violent undertow, dragging everything nearby down into the lightless depths. The destruction of my family had inadvertently created a sprawling power vacuum in the Rhode Island maritime sector. Preston was an incompetent fool, but his desperate attempt to sell the company had drawn a very real, very dangerous predator into our waters. My private internal phone line blipped. The red light illuminated, indicating a direct, secure connection. I tapped the speaker button. Nathan spoke, his voice tight with urgent concern. Deborah Security just flagged an anomaly in the underground executive garage. Someone bypassed the automated sentry gates using a cloned administrative keycard. They are in the building. The sense of finality evaporated, instantly replaced by a sharp spike of adrenaline. My father was a coward who fought with lawyers and guilt trips. My mother fought with rumors and societal pressure. But Nolan was a scavenger. He was a man who made his living carving up distressed assets and destroying lives for profit. Preston had promised him a lucrative acquisition, and I had humiliated him in front of his mark. A shark does not simply swim away when the prey is snatched from its jaws. It circles back, looking for a weaker flank. I locked the tablet and stood up, smoothing the wrinkles from my navy blazer. The family drama was concluded, but the corporate war had just escalated into physical territory. I walked toward the private elevator, knowing exactly who was waiting for me in the concrete shadows below. The descent from the penthouse to the subterranean levels of the Providence headquarters always felt like a transition between two different worlds. Above the city, the air was filtered, the surfaces were polished, and every variable was meticulously controlled. Below ground, the environment was raw, utility. The executive parking garage was a sprawling cavern of poured concrete thick support pillars and the low, relentless hum of industrial ventilation fans. I stepped out of the private elevator. The doors slid shut behind me, cutting off the soft, ambient music of the lobby. The silence of the underground structure was heavy, broken only by the sharp, rhythmic click of my heels echoing against the pavement. The air smelled of damp asphalt and lingering exhaust fumes. Most of my staff had gone home hours ago, leaving the reserved parking sector eerily vacant. I walked toward my vehicle, a sleek, dark sedan parked alone under a flickering fluorescent tube. The shadows stretched long and distorted across the driving lanes. I was mentally reviewing the termination protocols for the Newport branch, calculating the exact severance package I would deny my brother. The corporate board was secured. My father had surrendered. But the ocean teaches a very specific lesson about apex predators. When there is blood in the water, the sharks do not simply swim away because the first bite missed. They circle back, looking for a blind spot. A silhouette detached itself from the thick concrete pillar adjacent to my parking space. I stopped walking. I maintained a distance of 10 feet, keeping my posture relaxed but vigilant. I did not reach for my phone or display any outward signs of alarm. Panic is a currency predators feed on, and I refused to spend a single cent. The figure stepped forward, emerging from the gray shadows into the harsh pool of overhead light. It was Nolan. The polished corporate liquidator from the Newport Yacht Club had discarded his tailored suit jacket. He stood with his hands casually tucked into his trouser pockets, his white dress shirt unbuttoned at the collar. In the boardroom, he had projected the image of a sophisticated financial partner. Down here, in the subterranean isolation of a concrete bunker, the facade stripped away. He looked exactly like what he truly was, a scavenger. "Working late," Deborah Nolan remarked, his voice echoing off the concrete walls. His tone was conversational, dangerously smooth. "I hope you do not mind me waiting. Your lobby security is remarkably efficient, but building maintenance always leaves the delivery ramps unguarded. We have some unfinished business to discuss." I did not move. I analyzed his stance, his proximity, and his potential leverage. He was a man who made a living destroying legacy companies and dismantling the lives of incompetent heirs. He had flown to Rhode Island expecting an easy mark in Preston. I had publicly humiliated him, depriving his firm of a lucrative acquisition. He was not here to seek revenge. Scavengers do not care about pride, they care about profit. He was here to extract a toll. "We have zero business to discuss, Nolan," I replied, keeping my voice flat and carrying through the empty garage. "You attempted to purchase stolen corporate assets from a regional manager who lacked the equity to sell them. Your due diligence was non-existent. Your transaction is dead. The exit ramp is located at the north end of the facility. I suggest you use it." Nolan let out a low, resonant chuckle. He took a slow, deliberate step toward me. "You are a very impressive strategist," he said, tilting his head, acknowledging the trap I had sprung that morning. "You played your father and your brother flawlessly. You allowed Preston to dig his own grave, and you handed him the shovel. But your brilliant execution created a rather inconvenient mess. You see, Preston did not just forge a few internal ledgers to impress me. He actively siphoned liquid capital into private shell accounts. He committed federal wire fraud." He took another step forward, closing the distance between us to a mere 6 feet. "Now you own the parent holding company," Nolan continued, his voice dropping to a low, menacing register. "You are the sole proprietor of Oceanic Apex Solutions. If the Securities and Exchange Commission discovers that your subsidiary branch is a hotbed for embezzlement, they will not just investigate Preston. They will launch a full forensic audit of your entire empire. They will freeze your operating capital, they will subpoena your hard drives, and they will drag your pristine reputation through a grueling federal inquiry. Your stock valuation will plummet overnight." Nolan was outlining a legitimate corporate nightmare. The regulatory agencies did not care about family dynamics. They cared about compliance. An investigation of that magnitude would stall my operations for years, draining millions in legal defense fees. He knew this. He was counting on my desire to protect my kingdom. "But I can make it disappear," Nolan offered, spreading his hands in a gesture of false benevolence. "My boutique firm specializes in creative accounting and distressed asset management. We know how to bury toxic ledgers. We know how to scrub digital footprints so thoroughly that even the most zealous federal auditor will find nothing but clean, balanced books. I can erase Preston's embezzlement by tomorrow morning." I tilted my head, studying his face. "And what exactly does this miraculous cleanup cost?" Nolan smiled, a cold, predatory expression showing teeth. "A 10-year exclusive logistics contract between Oceanic Apex Solutions and my supply chain management firm," he demanded. "Above market rates, guaranteed quarterly payouts, and a non-disclosure agreement locking you into the terms. You give me the contract, and your brother avoids federal prison, while your holding company remains untouched. You refuse, and I make a single anonymous phone call to the Regulatory Commission tomorrow, highlighting the exact shell companies Preston used to steal your money." He took a final step forward, invading my personal space. The physical disparity between us was stark. He was a broad-shouldered man, towering over me, attempting to use his sheer size to enforce his demands. It was a classic, tired tactic employed by men who lacked intellectual leverage. He wanted me to step back. He wanted me to shrink away from his proximity to signal submission. I stood my ground. I did not flinch. The heavy silence of the parking garage pressed down around us. The only sound was the distant hum of the ventilation fans. Nolan stared down at me, waiting for the fear to set in, waiting for the desperate realization that I was cornered. I reached into the pocket of my blazer. My fingers closed around the cold, metallic casing of my key fob. I pressed the unlock button. A sharp, piercing electronic chirp echoed violently against the concrete pillars. The headlights of my sedan flashed bright, blinding white, cutting through the dim garage and illuminating Nolan's face in stark, unforgiving relief. The sudden, loud click of the unlocking mechanism sounded like the snapping of a steel trap. The sudden noise shattered his momentum. Nolan blinked, stepping back involuntarily, his eyes squinting against the harsh glare of the halogen beams. A soft, genuine laugh escaped my throat. It was a relaxed, unbothered sound that caught him entirely off guard. "You are a fascinating creature, Nolan," I said, pulling my smartphone from my inner pocket. "You walk into my building, bypass security, and attempt to extort the chief executive of a $900 million logistics firm using the sloppy financial crimes of a discarded middle manager. You actually believe you hold a winning hand." I unlocked my phone screen, navigating to the encrypted audio files I had secured during the morning board meeting. "Let me explain exactly how this scenario is going to play out." I continued stepping forward, reclaiming the physical space he had just abandoned. "I am not going to grant your firm a single contract. I am not going to bury Preston's embezzlement. In fact, my legal team is preparing to hand the unredacted ledgers directly to the federal authorities on Monday morning. I am self-reporting the subsidiary fraud." Nolan's eyes widened, his confident posture dissolving into genuine confusion. "You are going to trigger your own audit." "I am going to trigger a contained investigation," I corrected, my tone dropping to a chilling professional cadence. "Because unlike you, I actually understand compliance law. I instituted the internal verification protocols that caught Preston's theft. I have the digital logs, proving my oversight division flagged the unauthorized wire transfers the moment they occurred. Oceanic Apex Solutions is a victim of internal theft, not an accomplice. The authorities will scrutinize Preston, and they will leave my holding company entirely alone." I tapped the screen of my phone, pressing the play button on the audio file. The recording was crystal clear, capturing the exact moment the board meeting had collapsed earlier that morning. Nolan's own voice echoed through the concrete parking garage. "You told me you held the majority voting shares," the recorded version of Nolan snarled. "You provided financial statements indicating autonomous control of the fleet." I paused the playback, slipping the phone back into my blazer. "Do you know what the Regulatory Commission calls a boutique liquidation firm that attempts to purchase a multi-million-dollar company without verifying the actual ownership structure?" I asked, staring directly into his eyes. "They call them accessories to fraud." The color drained from his face, leaving him looking pallid and sickly under the fluorescent lights. The realization of his own vulnerability was finally taking root. "You failed to conduct basic corporate due diligence, Nolan." I explained, my voice striking like a hammer against an anvil. "You accepted falsified ledgers from an unverified seller. You were hours away from wiring capital to a man attempting to fence stolen assets. When I hand my internal findings to the federal investigators, your name is going to be featured prominently in the executive summary. Your firm will lose its operating licenses, your assets will be frozen pending investigation, and your wealthy clients will abandon you the second the subpoenas start flying." Nolan opened his mouth, but no words came out. He was a scavenger who had tried to feed on an apex predator, and he had just realized his own throat was exposed. "You do not possess leverage over me, Nolan," I whispered, stepping closer, forcing him to backpedal toward the shadows. You possess a massive, devastating liability. If you ever step foot on my property again, if you ever attempt to contact me or my family, I will personally ensure your entire portfolio is dismantled by the federal government." He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing in his throat. The menacing corporate shark had vanished entirely, replaced by a terrified man, desperate to preserve his own freedom. He did not attempt to negotiate. He did not offer a parting threat. Nolan turned on his heel and walked quickly toward the exit ramp, his footsteps echoing frantically against the pavement. He was retreating, abandoning the hunt, fleeing Rhode Island before the legal guillotine dropped. I watched him disappear into the shadows. The physical threat was neutralized. The corporate extortionist was banished. I opened the door of my sedan and slid into the leather driver's seat, the familiar smell of the immaculate interior wrapping around me. I started the engine, the powerful motor purring smoothly. I had dismantled Charles in the office. I had humiliated Virginia at the charity luncheon. I had outmaneuvered Nolan in the garage. Every logical, tactical, and financial weapon deployed against me had been systematically destroyed. But as I pulled out of the parking structure, merging onto the darkened city streets, I felt a lingering sense of cold anticipation. My parents were stripped of their wealth, their reputation, and their legal authority. They were backed into a corner with nothing left to lose. And when toxic families run out of rational ammunition, they do not surrender. They resort to the only warfare they have left. The financial battle was won, but the psychological war was about to reach its terminal velocity. Charles and Virginia were preparing to launch their final, desperate weapon, and it would arrive wrapped in the guise of ultimate betrayal. The following morning dawned with a harsh, brittle clarity. The sky over Providence was a brilliant, unyielding blue, scrubbed clean of the previous night's fog. I stood on the sprawling terrace of my penthouse, wrapped in a thick cashmere robe, a mug of dark roast coffee warming my hands. Below me, the city hummed with the early rush-hour traffic, a mechanical rhythm that grounded me in the present. The physical threat from Nolan had been neutralized in the garage, but the psychological warfare with my family was entering its terminal phase. I knew Charles and Virginia were entirely out of rational options. Their legal threats had shattered against the master deed. Their societal leverage had evaporated at the charity luncheon. Their golden child was paralyzed by the looming specter of a federal audit. They were cornered, trapped in the crumbling ruins of their own arrogance. And in Rhode Island high society, when the old guard runs out of ammunition, they resort to the only weapon they believe holds absolute power: the family name. My assistant had flagged a priority courier delivery before 8 o'clock. The envelope currently sat on the glass patio table, a thick, cream-colored square of heavy stock parchment. It was not sealed with wax this time. It was sealed with desperation. I set my coffee mug down and picked up the envelope. The paper felt heavy, substantial, designed to convey weight and authority. I slid my finger under the flap and pulled out a single typed page. The letterhead bore the formal crest of the Bailey Family Trust, an archaic symbol featuring a rigged schooner and a Latin motto about enduring strength. The text beneath it was stark, clinical, and dripping with delusional entitlement. It was an ultimatum, signed jointly by Charles and Virginia. The terms were aggressively simple. They demanded that I immediately restore Preston's operational access to the subsidiary accounts. Furthermore, they demanded that I sign over 50% of the voting equity in Oceanic Apex Solutions to the family trust, allowing Charles to resume his position as patriarch and protecting the legacy from my erratic behavior. If I failed to comply by the end of the week, the consequences were laid out in a brutal, bulleted list. They would formally and publicly disown me. They would strip my name from the family archives, the Historical Society registries, and the Foundation charters. They promised to erase me so thoroughly from the Rhode Island maritime history that future generations would believe Charles and Virginia Bailey only ever had one child. I read the document twice, letting the sheer absurdity of their demands wash over me. They truly believed that the name Bailey was my most valuable asset. They were convinced that the threat of excommunication would break my resolve. They could not comprehend that a woman who had built a $900 million empire from scratch did not require their permission to exist. They were offering to banish me from a kingdom that I already owned. I walked over to the edge of the terrace, resting my hands on the cold glass railing. The wind whipped across the balcony, pulling at my hair, carrying the faint scent of salt and exhaust fumes. For 32 years, that name had been a cage. It had dictated how I spoke, how I dressed, and how I was expected to shrink myself to accommodate my brother's fragile ego. It was the name that told me to leave the harbor to the men. It was the name that poured $5,000 wine to celebrate my exile. They were threatening to take away my chains and calling it a punishment. I turned back to the patio table. A large, polished abalone shell sat near the center, serving as a decorative centerpiece. The shell was a fascinating object. Abalone survive in the most turbulent, brutal environments the ocean has to offer. They cling to jagged rocks, pounded constantly by crashing waves and crushing pressure. And in response to that relentless trauma, they secrete layers of nacre, building a shell so incredibly resilient that it is nearly impossible to shatter. The ocean tries to crush them, and they respond by becoming unbreakable. I picked up the typed ultimatum and a small silver lighter from the side table. I flicked the ignition. A sharp, clean flame sprang to life, steady against the morning wind. I held the bottom corner of the heavy parchment to the fire. The paper caught instantly, the edges curling and blackening as the heat consumed the arrogant demands. I watched the flame crawl upward, eating through the family crest, obliterating the signatures of Charles and Virginia. When the heat reached my fingertips, I dropped the burning document into the center of the abalone shell. I stood there in the quiet morning light, watching the ultimatum reduce itself to a pile of gray, fragile ash. The symbolism was not lost on me. They had tried to apply crushing pressure, and they had simply burned away the last remaining tether that bound me to their illusion. I did not feel grief. I did not feel the phantom ache of a lost family. I felt a profound, soaring sense of absolute sovereignty. I pulled my smartphone from the pocket of my robe. There was one final logistical detail to arrange before the execution was complete. The annual Bailey Maritime Gala was scheduled for tomorrow evening. It was the premier event of the season, designed entirely to celebrate Preston's imaginary success and solidify the family dynasty in front of the local politicians and business elite. It was the exact stage they had built to showcase their power. It was the perfect stage to dismantle it. I opened my email client and navigated to the digital invitation I had received months ago before the boardroom ambush. I tapped the reply button. I drafted a brief, formal message directed to Charles, Virginia, and their event coordinators. I confirmed my attendance for the gala. I added a single, ominous addendum stating that I would be making a significant public announcement regarding the future structuring of the family legacy. I hit send. The notification pinged, signaling the delivery. I knew exactly how they would interpret that message. Charles would read it and believe his ultimatum had worked. Virginia would see the RSVP and assume I was coming to publicly surrender to beg for my place back in the family portrait. Preston would prepare a smug, condescending speech ready to welcome his chastised sister back into the fold. They were going to spend the next 36 hours celebrating a victory that did not exist. They were going to polish their shoes, press their tuxedos, and walk into that ballroom convinced they had broken the apex predator. I picked up my coffee mug, taking a slow, deep sip. The dark roast tasted rich and grounding. I looked down at the abalone shell resting on the glass table. The ash had settled a pale gray dust against the iridescent mother of pearl. A single gust of wind swept across the terrace, catching the delicate remains of the ultimatum and scattering them into the Rhode Island sky until there was nothing left. The stage was set. The trap was primed. Tomorrow night, I would walk into a room filled with the most powerful people in the state, and I would turn a celebration of my brother's ego into a live, public, corporate execution. The Rosecliff Mansion in Newport was unrecognizable from the daytime charity luncheon. Tonight, it was draped in the full, suffocating opulence of a Bailey Maritime gala. Spotlights swept across the limestone facade, reflecting off the manicured lawns and the rows of imported luxury sedans. Inside the grand ballroom, the air was thick with the scent of expensive floral arrangements and the low hum of Rhode Island's political and financial elite. I arrived an hour after the doors opened, bypassing the red carpet and slipping through a side entrance, typically reserved for catering staff. I wore a tailored black evening gown, devoid of any excessive embellishment. I was not here to participate in a fashion show. I was here to execute a corporate dismantling. Standing in the shadows near the sound engineer's booth, I had a perfect vantage point of the entire room. The elite crowd mingled, sipping champagne and exchanging calculated pleasantries. At the center of it all stood my family, radiating a toxic, blinding confidence. Virginia was holding court draped in diamonds, acting as the triumphant matriarch. Charles stood nearby, his posture rigid, exuding the aura of a patriarch who had successfully defended his kingdom against a rebellious uprising. And then there was Preston. He was practically glowing. He wore a crisp tuxedo, a fresh silk pocket square, and an expression of unbearable smugness. He believed the RSVP I had sent the previous morning was a formal white flag. He thought the ultimatum had worked. He thought I was hiding in the crowd, preparing to grovel for my reinstatement into the family trust. He did not realize he was celebrating on a trapdoor. The orchestra concluded their set, lowering their instruments as the master of ceremonies stepped up to the podium. He tapped the microphone, demanding the room's attention. "Ladies and gentlemen, honored guests," the MC boomed, his voice echoing through the massive crystal chandeliers. "Tonight we gather to celebrate a legacy of maritime excellence. And to guide us into the future, I give you the Chief Executive Officer of Bailey Maritime, Preston Bailey." The ballroom erupted into enthusiastic applause. Preston practically bounded up the stairs to the stage. He adjusted the microphone, smoothing his lapels, soaking in the validation of the elite crowd. This was his element. This was the validation he craved above all else. "Thank you," Preston began, his voice amplified perfectly by the state-of-the-art sound system. "It is an honor to stand before you tonight. The ocean is an unforgiving frontier. It requires vision, strength, and a deep understanding of legacy. Recently, our company faced some unprecedented internal challenges." He paused, letting a dramatic sigh escape his lips, playing the role of the weary but victorious leader. "There were those who sought to disrupt our operations," he continued, casting a meaningful glance out into the audience, searching for me in the crowd. "There were those who believed they could hijack the Bailey name for their own selfish gain. But let me assure you, the foundation of this family is unbreakable. We have successfully excised the dead weight holding us back. We are moving forward, stronger and more independent than ever." He raised his glass, preparing to deliver the toast that would solidify his false narrative. I gave a curt nod to my head of security, Nathan, who was standing discreetly beside the sound engineer. Nathan reached forward and flipped a single toggle switch on the master mixing board. Preston's microphone cut out mid-syllable. The sudden silence was jarring. Preston tapped the head of the microphone, frowning, his eyebrows knitting together in confusion. He looked offstage toward the sound booth, assuming it was a technical glitch. He cleared his throat, trying to project his voice across the massive ballroom without amplification. "Is this working?" he called out, his voice sounding incredibly small and frail without the speakers. I stepped out of the shadows. I did not walk down the center aisle this time. I walked directly up the side stairs ascending the stage, while Preston was still fumbling with the dead microphone. My heels clicked a slow, deliberate rhythm against the wooden floorboards. Preston saw me approach. The arrogant smirk vanished from his face, replaced instantly by a flash of genuine panic. He took a step backward, his eyes darting frantically between me and the silent audience. "What are you doing here?" he hissed, keeping his voice low, desperately trying to maintain decorum. "You are supposed to be in the audience. You are supposed to be surrendering." "I am not here to surrender, Preston," I replied, my voice calm and conversational, projecting easily in the quiet room. "I am here to fulfill your ultimatum. I promised a public announcement." I reached into the pocket of my black gown and pulled out a small silver flash drive. I tossed it to the sound engineer, who caught it seamlessly. "Plug it in," I instructed. The massive digital screens flanking the stage, which had previously displayed the Bailey family crest, flickered to life. The high-definition projectors illuminated the ballroom, casting a cold, blue glow across the faces of the elite guests. A collective gasp rippled through the audience. It was a sharp intake of breath, the pebble dropping into a very deep, very quiet pond. The screens were not displaying a slideshow of historical ships or charitable achievements. They were displaying the unredacted corporate filings of Oceanic Apex Solutions. The documents were massive, blown up to a staggering scale. The text was undeniable. The organizational chart traced the ownership structure, clearly highlighting Bailey Maritime as a defunct, heavily restricted subsidiary. And at the very top, occupying the position of sole proprietor and absolute majority shareholder, was my name, Deborah Bailey. The silence in the room transformed from confusion to stunned, absolute shock. The elite politicians and shipping magnates were reading the irrefutable legal proof that the man standing on stage was a complete fraud. I walked over to the podium. I reached into the breast pocket of Preston's tuxedo, pulling out his sleek backup microphone. I clicked it on, the green light indicating it was live. "Good evening, everyone," I said, my voice booming through the speakers, carrying the weight of absolute authority. "My brother was just speaking to you about vision and legacy. I felt it was important to clarify exactly whose legacy you are celebrating tonight." I turned slightly, ensuring the cameras caught my profile against the massive screens displaying my ownership. 5 years ago, Bailey Maritime was bankrupt. I continued projecting my voice over the rising murmur of the crowd. It was destroyed by gross mismanagement and a fundamental lack of operational competence. I bought the debt. I structured the holding company. I built the $900 million biotech logistics network that currently anchors the Rhode Island economy. Preston Bailey is not a chief executive. He is a regional manager for a subsidiary that I own entirely. Preston stood frozen, his face a mask of absolute horror. He looked out into the crowd, watching his entire social and professional reality disintegrate in real time. And as of this exact moment, I announced, my voice dropping to a chilling professional register, that subsidiary is officially dissolved. The murmur in the crowd spiked into a chaotic hum. "You cannot do this," Preston stammered, stepping forward, his voice cracking with desperation. "You are destroying the family." Down in the front row, Charles finally broke free from his shock. The patriarch realized his kingdom was being publicly executed. He roared a furious, unintelligible sound and lunged toward the stage stairs, intending to physically stop the broadcast. He made it exactly 2 steps before Nathan's security team intercepted him. 3 large men in dark suits stepped seamlessly into his path, forming an impenetrable human wall. Charles slammed against them, his face purple with rage, demanding they step aside. The security team did not even flinch, holding him firmly in place. I looked down at my father, struggling against the guards. I looked at Virginia, who had collapsed into a chair, covering her face with her hands, weeping for the loss of her illusion. I looked at Preston standing beside me, a hollow, broken shell of a man. Yesterday you sent me an ultimatum. I stated, speaking directly into the microphone, ensuring every word was permanently recorded by the local press in attendance. You threatened to disown me and erase my name from the family history if I did not surrender my empire to cover Preston's federal embezzlement. The mention of federal embezzlement sent a final, devastating shockwave through the room. I am officially accepting your terms, I declared, my voice ringing with finality. You do not need to disown me, Charles. I am disowning you. A $900 million empire requires no toxic legacy to survive. I am walking away from the Bailey name permanently. You can keep the ashes. I set the microphone down on the podium. It landed with a soft, definitive thud. I turned my back on Preston, my family, and the stunned elite of Rhode Island. I walked off the stage, descending the stairs and moving purposefully toward the exit. The crowd parted for me, their eyes wide, recognizing they had just witnessed the absolute destruction of a dynasty. The corporate guillotine had fallen. The public execution was complete. But there was still one final legal stroke required to ensure they could never rebuild from the wreckage. The morning after the Newport Gala, the air in my Providence office felt different. It was lighter somehow, scrubbed clean of the lingering pressure that had defined the past 5 years. The city below was waking up, the harbor dotted with ferries and commercial fishing vessels. From my window, I watched the logistics network of Oceanic Apex Solutions operating with mechanical precision. The public spectacle was over. The elite of Rhode Island had witnessed the destruction of the Bailey dynasty firsthand. But a public execution is only a performance. The true dismantling happens behind closed doors, layered in dense legal jargon and notarized signatures. Nathan, my general counsel, was already waiting in the conference room. A thick stack of unyielding legal documents rested on the polished mahogany table. The financial guillotine was primed and waiting. I took my seat at the head of the table, opening the first leather-bound folder. We begin with the dissolution of the subsidiary, I instructed, my voice calm and completely devoid of sentiment. Nathan slid a familiar piece of paper across the table. It was the cease and desist letter Charles had sent days ago, the one sealed with the archaic crimson wax, the very document he had intended to use as a weapon to force my submission, was now the legal mechanism I would use to erase him. By demanding I cease all operational contact with Bailey Maritime, Charles had formally documented his hostility toward the parent holding company. Under standard corporate governance regulations, a subsidiary branch that actively attempts to sever ties with its parent entity creates a state of irreconcilable operational interference. I was using his own threat to legally justify dismantling his kingdom. I picked up a heavy silver fountain pen and signed my name across the bottom of the dissolution decree. The sharp scratch of the nib against the thick parchment echoed in the quiet room. A single definitive sound marking the end of a century-old legacy. The Bailey Maritime Operations subsidiary was officially dissolved. The assets, the contracts, and the physical vessels were immediately absorbed into the primary structure of Oceanic Apex Solutions. The name Bailey was wiped from the corporate registry, replaced by a sterile alphanumeric identifier. Moving on to personnel, Nathan stated, opening the second folder. This was the execution warrant for the Golden Child. Preston was no longer a regional manager. He was an unemployed civilian facing overwhelming legal liability. I reviewed the termination paperwork. The cause for dismissal was explicitly stated as gross financial misconduct and internal embezzlement. I had the digital footprint, the unauthorized wire transfers, and the falsified invoices neatly categorized in an attached appendix. The evidence was bulletproof. I signed the termination notice, the ink flowing smoothly over the paper. But I was not content to simply fire Preston. I wanted to ensure he understood the exact nature of the world he had tried to navigate. I wanted him to experience the consequences of his own staggering incompetence. When Preston attempted to sell the subsidiary to Nolan, he had signed a preliminary letter of intent. He thought he was initiating a lucrative buyout. He did not read the fine print. Nolan was a scavenger, and scavengers build predatory clauses into every contract they draft. By signing that letter, Preston had personally guaranteed the transactional fees regardless of whether the deal closed. Because I had torpedoed the acquisition, Nolan was legally entitled to collect a massive penalty fee directly from Preston's personal assets that were currently frozen and rapidly depleting. To avoid personal bankruptcy and the very real threat of federal fraud charges, which I had agreed to temporarily withhold in exchange for his complete capitulation, Preston had been forced to negotiate a settlement with Nolan. The terms were incredibly poetic. Preston, the man who had poured $5,000 wine to celebrate my exile, the man who believed he was a titan of industry, was legally indentured to Nolan's liquidation firm. To pay off the massive penalty fee, he was required to work as a junior data entry clerk for the next 3 years. He would spend his days sitting in a gray cubicle, manually inputting the financial ruins of distressed companies, earning minimum wage, while a portion of his paycheck was automatically garnished. The golden child had been reduced to an administrative drone, serving the very predator he had tried to unleash upon me. I signed the non-disclosure agreement, sealing Preston's fate. The final folder contained the financial restructuring for Charles and Virginia. For 5 years, I had authorized generous monthly stipends drawn from the subsidiary accounts to maintain their lavish lifestyle. Those funds paid for the tailored suits, the charity luncheons, and the sprawling Newport estate. I drew a single clean line through the stipend authorization box. The monthly transfers were slashed to 0. Charles and Virginia were completely cut off from the oceanic apex capital flow. They were now reliant solely on their personal savings, which I knew were dangerously thin. The corporate execution was complete. The legal architecture that sustained their arrogance had been systematically dismantled and burned to ash. I set the silver fountain pen down. The silence in the conference room was profound. Nathan closed the folders, gathering the documents into a neat stack. "The notices have been dispatched via courier," Nathan confirmed. "They will receive the final paperwork before noon." I nodded, turning my gaze back to the window. The harbor was bustling with activity, unaware of the seismic shift that had just occurred in the boardrooms above. I had reclaimed my empire. I had drawn an iron boundary, neutralizing every threat they had mounted against me. The societal humiliation was complete. The financial severing was absolute. But there was one final string attached to the past. One physical monument to their ego that technically belonged to my holding company. The Newport estate. The sprawling limestone mansion where I had been raised, where Charles had dictated his unyielding demands and Virginia had orchestrated her social climbing. It was the crown jewel of the Bailey family pride, the physical manifestation of their perceived superiority. And it was collateral in the debt I had bought 5 years ago. I had destroyed their corporate authority and their social standing. But as long as they resided behind those iron gates, they would still cling to the illusion of power. They would still believe they possessed a sliver of leverage, a physical fortress to retreat to. It was time to collect the collateral. It was time to issue the eviction. The architecture of revenge is rarely built with sudden explosions. It is constructed through quiet, deliberate subtraction. You remove a single support beam here, you extract a cornerstone there, until the entire towering structure collapses under the weight of its own gravity. Sitting in my Providence high-rise, I watched the morning sun scatter across the harbor. The corporate execution was finalized, the board was dissolved, the golden child was indentured to a scavenger, and the financial stipends were severed. I had stripped my parents of their operational authority and their social currency. But high society operates on a very specific visual language. As long as Charles and Virginia resided behind the wrought iron gates of the Newport estate, they would maintain the illusion of relevance. That sprawling limestone mansion was the physical embodiment of their arrogance. It was the fortress where they hosted lavish galas, where Charles drank premium scotch and dictated the terms of my obedience, where Virginia arranged floral centerpieces and spun fictions about her perfect family. They believed the house was their birthright. They had conveniently forgotten that birthrights require solvency to survive. 5 years ago, when Preston bankrupted the fleet, the banks were ready to seize every physical asset the family possessed. When I stepped in, operating through my blind holding company, I absorbed the debt. Charles was so frantic to save his shipping routes that he signed a comprehensive collateral agreement without bothering to scrutinize the fine print. He assumed his anonymous New York investors cared only about maritime logistics. He assumed they would never touch his residential real estate. He assumed, incorrectly. The deed to the Newport estate had belonged to Oceanic Apex Solutions for half a decade. I had essentially been acting as their landlord, allowing them to live rent-free in a corporate asset while they insulted my career choices over Sunday roast. That lease expired today. Nathan, my general counsel, tapped lightly on the open glass door of my office. He did not carry a thick binder this time. He held only a sleek digital tablet. He walked over and set the device flat on my desk. "The courier is turning onto the coastal highway," Nathan informed me, his tone carrying the crisp efficiency I valued above all else. "He will reach the front gates in approximately 8 minutes." I nodded, keeping my eyes on the tablet screen. "Thank you, Nathan. That will be all for this morning." He retreated, leaving me alone in the quiet expanse of my office. I tapped the screen, activating the encrypted surveillance network I had installed on the estate grounds years ago. The high-definition camera feed flickered to life, displaying the grand, sweeping driveway of the property I grew up in. The Rhode Island coastal wind whipped through the ancient oak trees lining the perimeter. The manicured lawn looked pristine green and vibrant against the pale gray stone of the mansion facade. It was a beautiful property. It was also a freezing, loveless museum where I had spent my childhood learning how to shrink myself into the background. On the screen, a dark blue delivery vehicle pulled through the open wrought iron gates. The tires crunched loudly against the white gravel, making a slow, methodical approach toward the main entrance. My pulse remained steady. I leaned back in my leather chair, sipping my black coffee, letting the warmth spread through my chest. The courier stepped out of the vehicle, holding a rigid cardboard envelope. He climbed the wide marble steps and pressed the brass doorbell. The weight felt suspended, drawn out by the high-definition clarity of the security feed. I activated the external audio receiver, listening to the ambient sounds of the coastal morning, the cry of seagulls, the rustle of leaves, and finally, the heavy metallic click of the front door unlocking. Charles opened the door. He was wearing a silk dressing gown, looking haggard and hollowed out. The vibrant, commanding patriarch from 2 days ago was gone, replaced by a man who had not slept since the gala. He stared at the courier with dull, confused eyes. "Delivery for Charles and Virginia Bailey," the courier announced, his voice polite but firm. He extended the electronic clipboard, demanding a signature. Charles signed the digital screen with a trembling hand. He took the rigid envelope, dismissing the driver with a weak wave of his hand. He did not step back inside immediately. He stood on the porch, tearing the cardboard strip away and pulling out the stack of formal legal parchment. I watched his eyes track across the bold-printed header, "Notice to vacate." The document was drafted with uncompromising legal precision. It clearly stated that the property located at their exclusive zip code was a registered corporate asset of Oceanic Apex Solutions. It cited the dissolution of the subsidiary branch and the termination of their executive housing privileges. They were given exactly 30 days to clear their personal belongings and surrender the keys. Charles read the first paragraph. His knees buckled slightly. He gripped the stone pillar of the porch to steady himself, his knuckles turning stark white against the gray rock. "Who is it, Charles?" Virginia's voice drifted through the open doorway, carrying a fragile, nervous tremor. She stepped out onto the porch, pulling a cashmere shawl tightly around her shoulders. She looked at her husband, noticing his pallid complexion and the trembling papers in his hand. "What does that say?" she asked, reaching for the documents. Charles did not resist. He let her pull the parchment from his grasp. Virginia read the words. The audio feed picked up the sharp, ragged intake of her breath. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated devastation. "They are evicting us," Virginia whispered, the parchment fluttering in her shaking hands. "She is throwing us out onto the street. We have to fight this, Charles. Call Carmichael. Tell him to file an injunction. We can tie this up in the courts for years." Charles shook his head, a slow, defeated motion. "We cannot call Carmichael, Virginia. He will not represent us without a retainer." "Then write him a check!" she shrieked, her voice echoing sharply against the stone facade, losing every ounce of her refined, aristocratic polish. "We do not have the money," Virginia Charles replied, his tone, hollow, echoing with the finality of a grave. It was the ultimate brilliant cruelty of timing. Yesterday, when I froze their luxury accounts, Virginia had lied to the caterer, claiming the funds were tied up due to a bothersome new municipal property tax ordinance. That ordinance was not a fiction. It was a very real, aggressive tax hike targeting the wealthiest coastal districts in the state. And the deadline to pay those municipal taxes had arrived exactly 24 hours ago. Charles had drained their personal liquid savings trying to cover the municipal bill, hoping to buy them time before the frozen corporate accounts were restored. He had emptied their private coffers to pay taxes on a house they no longer owned. They were financially paralyzed. They could not afford to hire a defense attorney. They could not afford to rent an apartment in their prestigious neighborhood. They could not afford the moving trucks required to transport their antique furniture. Virginia stared at her husband, the realization washing over her in a tidal wave of horror. The phantom wealth was gone. The social shield was shattered. They were standing on a marble porch that belonged to the daughter they had exiled. "No," Virginia gasped, her knees giving out. She collapsed backward onto the outdoor designer sofa positioned near the entryway. She began to weep. It was not a quiet, dignified cry. It was a loud, racking sob that tore from the back of her throat. I listened to the sound through the tablet speakers, analyzing the frequency of her despair. She was not crying because her family was fractured. She was not shedding a single tear for the daughter she had treated like a secondary asset. She was not mourning the shattered relationship with her child. She was weeping for the loss of her address. She was mourning the zip code, the garden parties, and the illusion of supremacy. She was crying because she would never again walk down the grand staircase of the Rosecliff mansion as an honored guest. Charles did not comfort her. He stood frozen, staring blankly at the white gravel driveway, watching the courier climb back into his delivery vehicle. The engine started. The tires crunched as the van shifted into gear and rolled slowly toward the open iron gates heading back toward the coastal highway. Charles reached forward, grabbing the heavy brass handle of the front door. He looked out at the ocean one last time, a broken king surveying a kingdom that had never truly been his. He pulled the door shut. The audio receiver picked up the sound with startling clarity. A heavy, definitive thud of thick oak sealing against a stone frame. The brass lock clicked, echoing like a gavel striking a judge's bench. The pebble had dropped. I reached out and tapped the screen, terminating the surveillance feed. The tablet went dark, reflecting my own calm, composed face in the smooth black glass. The boundary was drawn in iron and law. The physical monument to their ego was secured. The toxic cycle that had defined my existence for 3 decades was permanently broken. I stood up from my desk, smoothing the fabric of my tailored trousers. The air in the office felt crisp, charged with the energy of a sprawling, unwritten future. I poured the remainder of my coffee into a nearby plant, walking toward the expansive windows overlooking the harbor. The scapegoat was gone forever. There was no one left to carry their burdens, hide their failures, or subsidize their arrogance. They were alone, trapped in a reality they had manufactured entirely by themselves. The dominoes had finished falling. The board was cleared. Now there was only the vast open water stretching out toward the horizon, waiting to be navigated on my own terms. The deep thrum of the twin diesel engines vibrated through the teak deck beneath my bare feet. I stood at the bow of my personal yacht, cutting a clean white wake through the churning, slate-gray waters of Narragansett Bay. The coastline of Rhode Island was slowly shrinking in the distance, transforming from a towering landscape of historic wealth into a thin, blurred line on the horizon. The coastal wind was fierce and unyielding, whipping my hair across my face, carrying the sharp, clean scent of brine and open water. For the first time in 32 years, I was not bracing myself against a storm. I was riding it. The frantic, dizzying cadence of the past few weeks had finally evaporated. The endless strategy sessions, the corporate legal maneuvers, the calculated societal takedowns, all of it had settled into a profound, unshakable peace. The Rhode Island elite were still reeling from the shockwaves of the Maritime Gala. The local business syndicates were scrambling to understand the sudden total restructuring of the most powerful logistical network in the Northeast. But out here on the water, the noise of their gossip and their panic could not reach me. The silence of the open ocean was vast and absolute. I thought about Charles and Virginia, currently surrounded by cardboard boxes in the cavernous, echoing halls of the Newport estate. They had 29 days left to pack the remnants of a dynasty they had squandered. They were forced to catalog their antique furniture and their designer wardrobes, knowing they could not afford to store a fraction of their possessions. I thought about Preston, sitting in a gray, windowless cubicle, staring at spreadsheet data for a predatory liquidator. His wages were actively garnished to pay for a debt generated by his own staggering arrogance. The equilibrium of the universe had been brutally restored. The architects of my subjugation were now trapped in the exact cages they had constructed. They had spent their entire lives trying to convince me that my worth was defined entirely by my utility to their egos. They had weaponized my loyalty and penalized my competence. They failed to realize that every burden they placed on my shoulders only served to build the immense strength I would eventually use to dismantle them. I walked away from the bow and took a seat on the plush white leather seating area near the stern. A small glass table held my laptop, its sleek metallic casing gleaming under the afternoon sun. I flipped the lid open. The screen flared to life instantly, connecting to the encrypted satellite network. My inbox was a continuous stream of operational updates, logistical reports, and high-level executive briefings. Oceanic Apex Solutions was thriving, unburdened by the parasitic drain of the defunct subsidiary. But one specific notification caught my attention. It was an email marked with high priority, originating from the editorial desk of a premier global financial journal. The subject line read, "Interview request, the architect of Oceanic Apex." The body of the message was drafted with careful, practiced reverence. The senior editor was requesting an exclusive sit-down interview. They wanted the cover story for their next monthly issue. They wanted to detail my sudden, unprecedented rise from the invisible shadows of a crumbling family fleet into the sole, sovereign titan of a $900 million marine biotech empire. They wanted to know the strategic mind behind the flawless corporate execution that had dismantled the historic Bailey shipping legacy in a matter of days. They offered a professional photographer, a sprawling, multi-page spread, and the opportunity to control the public narrative entirely. A month ago, a year ago, an 18-year-old girl standing in a drafty warehouse seeking her father's validation would have jumped at the opportunity. The younger version of me would have craved the glossy magazine cover, utilizing the global publication as a desperate shield to prove her intrinsic value to the people who had discarded her. She would have wanted the world to read the article and force her family to acknowledge her brilliance. But the woman, sitting on the deck of the yacht, felt no such compulsion. Validation is a currency required only by those who doubt their own solvency. I did not need a financial journal to legitimize my existence. I did not need an article to explain my brilliance to a society that only respected wealth and pedigree. The empire I built was a monument that spoke entirely for itself. I had nothing left to prove to anyone. I moved the cursor over the message. I did not draft a polite refusal. I did not forward the request to a public relations liaison to schedule a convenient time. I clicked the archive button. The prestigious invitation vanished from my inbox, disappearing into the digital void. I closed the laptop. The quiet, satisfying click of the lid snapping shut echoed lightly against the fiberglass hull. I had spent a lifetime seeking permission to take up space in a world designed to keep me small. I was done explaining my right to exist. I stood up, leaving the electronic devices behind, and walked back toward the sturdy metal railing. The yacht hit a deep ocean swell, lifting the bow toward the cloudless sky before crashing downward into the trough of the wave. The impact sent a heavy, pluming spray of seawater cascading over the port side. The freezing salt water hit my face a sharp, stinging, sudden rush of physical sensation. The icy spray dripped from my chin, soaking the collar of my light linen sweater. It was a chaotic, untamed impact, and it felt incredible. It was a baptism into total autonomy. The cold water washed away the lingering dust of the Newport estate, the scent of artificial vanilla lattes, and the suffocating echoes of mahogany boardrooms. It cleared my mind, leaving behind a stark, beautiful clarity. My parents had tried to burn my future in a backyard of their own design. They had ignited every bridge they could find, hoping to strand me on an island of guilt and obligation. But they had failed to recognize a fundamental truth. They burned the ties, but they could never burn the woman who built the empire. The scapegoat they had manufactured was dead. The invisible mule who carried their heavy financial burdens while they paraded in tailored tuxedos and diamond necklaces had been laid to rest. I had transformed the very traits they despised, my calculating mind, my unyielding discipline, my refusal to accept defeat, into the exact weapons that secured my liberation. The abalone shell does not shatter under the crushing depths. It hardens. It secretes layer upon layer of impenetrable armor until the organism inside is safe from the violent currents. I had survived the crushing pressure of the Bailey family trust, and I had emerged unbroken. I wiped the salt water from my cheek, leaning against the cold railing. The horizon was vast, an endless, uninterrupted line where the deep blue of the Atlantic met the pale sky. There were no borders out here. There were no gates and no unwritten rules dictated by decaying aristocratic bloodlines. The future was a blank ledger, waiting to be written entirely in my own hand. The rhythm of the engines carried me forward, pushing deeper into the uncharted waters. If you are listening to this right now, and you recognize the echo of my story in your own life, pay very close attention. If you are sitting at a dining table where your achievements are treated as threats, where your boundaries are labeled as betrayals, and where your strength is only valued when it can be harvested for someone else's comfort, you have a decision to make. You cannot negotiate with people who view your independence as a personal insult. You cannot heal in the exact same environment that broke you. If your family only respects you when you shrink, stop shrinking. Stop waiting for permission to claim the life you have earned through your own sweat and resilience. Gather your evidence, build your sanctuary in silence, and prepare your exit. The ocean is vast, and you were meant to own it. The heavy mahogany doors of the boardroom closing in my face did not signify the end of my life. They signified the end of my servitude. When Charles and Virginia Bailey, alongside their golden son Preston, orchestrated my eviction from the family legacy they believed they were excising a nuisance. They thought they were the architects of their own triumph, raising a $5,000 glass of Chateau Petrus to celebrate the removal of the very foundation that kept them afloat. The irony was palpable, thick enough to choke on. They were celebrating a $900 million empire, my empire, convinced that their pedigree and their name granted them immunity from the consequences of their arrogance. What transpired over those ensuing weeks was not merely a corporate restructuring or a hostile takeover. It was a profound, agonizing, and ultimately liberating exercise in understanding what family actually means, and perhaps more importantly, what it does not. The American cultural narrative often romanticizes the traditional family structure, weaving a mythos around the sanctity of blood ties. We are taught to revere the hierarchy, the patriarch's wisdom, the matriarch's grace, and the inherent duty to support our kin. We are told that family is our anchor, our safe harbor in the tempest of life. But what happens when the harbor itself is the storm? What happens when the anchor is tied not to the ocean floor, but to your neck? My story is a stark reflection of a parenting model built on delusion rather than truth. Charles and Virginia did not parent, they managed. They managed their image, their social standing, and their children viewing us not as individuals, but as assets and liabilities on a balance sheet. Preston, the golden child, was the favored asset, an investment expected to yield unparalleled returns simply because of his gender and his compliance with their illusion. He was coddled, indulged, and protected from the harsh realities of his own incompetence. When he bankrupted the family fleet, they didn't hold him accountable. They looked away, preferring to sacrifice the legacy rather than shatter their manufactured reality. And then there was me. I was the liability they couldn't afford to acknowledge, yet desperately relied upon. I was the invisible mule expected to carry the weight of their failures in silence. When I built Oceanic Apex Solutions and secretly absorbed their debts, I thought I was fulfilling my familial duty. I thought that by saving them from public ruin, I was earning my place at the table. But Charles's dismissal of my early business proposals, "Leave the harbor to the men, Debbie," was not just an isolated incident of sexism. It was the defining ethos of his parenting. My competence was threatening, my independence a rebellion. This dynamic reveals a critical flaw in how we approach family responsibility. We often conflate loyalty with subservience. True family responsibility is not about blind obedience or shielding our loved ones from the consequences of their actions. It is about honesty, fairness, and emotional awareness. It is about recognizing the inherent worth of a child, not for what they can produce or how they elevate the family name, but for who they are. Charles and Virginia lacked this emotional awareness entirely. When Virginia's charity luncheon was interrupted by the truth of my ownership, her despair was not for the fractured relationship with her daughter, it was for the crumbling of her social facade. When Charles delivered that pathetic, unannounced apology in my office, armed with a vanilla latte he incorrectly remembered as my favorite, he wasn't seeking reconciliation. He was seeking a bailout. Their love was conditional, transactional, and entirely dependent on my utility to their egos. Raising children within a traditional family structure does not automatically confer virtue. The structure itself is morally neutral. It is the values enacted within that structure that matter. Honesty requires acknowledging a child's strengths and weaknesses without resorting to the extremes of the golden child or the scapegoat. Fairness means holding all children to a standard of accountability, preparing them for a world that will not care about their last name. Emotional awareness involves listening to them, understanding their fears, and validating their experiences. When these values are absent, the family becomes a crucible of toxicity. Preston's descent into federal embezzlement was not merely the result of a predatory corporate liquidator like Nolan. It was the inevitable consequence of a lifetime of unearned entitlement. He was never taught to navigate failure, so he resorted to fraud to maintain the illusion his parents demanded. Charles and Virginia, in their desperation to protect the Bailey name, nearly destroyed the very legacy they claimed to revere. My decision to freeze their accounts, expose Preston's fraud, and eventually evict them from the Newport estate was not born of malice. It was an act of profound self-preservation. It was the moment I stopped subscribing to their twisted definition of loyalty and embraced my own sovereignty. The American narrative champions the self-made individual, the one who pulls themselves up by their bootstraps. But we rarely discuss the courage it takes to cut the bootstraps when they are tied to a sinking ship. The ultimate lesson here is not about corporate maneuvering or financial vindication. It is about the vital importance of drawing boundaries. We are conditioned to believe that severing ties with family is the ultimate failure, a shameful abdication of duty. We are told that blood is thicker than water, a phrase often misquoted and misused to demand infinite tolerance for abuse. The original proverb, "the blood of the covenant is thicker than the water of the womb," actually suggests that the bonds we choose are stronger than those we are born into. If your family only respects you when you shrink, stop shrinking. You do not owe your sanity, your success, or your future to people who view your independence as a personal insult. You cannot heal in the exact same environment that broke you. True family is not defined by shared DNA. It is defined by mutual respect, unwavering support, and the freedom to grow into the fullest version of yourself. We must redefine our long-term guidance for children. It is not enough to prepare them for the workforce or to instill a sense of pride in their heritage. We must teach them emotional resilience. We must teach them that their worth is intrinsic, not contingent on their utility. We must teach them how to recognize healthy dynamics and how to protect themselves from toxic ones, even when those dynamics originate at home. As I stood on the deck of my yacht, feeling the freezing, chaotic spray of the Narragansett Bay against my face, the realization was absolute. I had dismantled the architecture of my subjugation. I had stripped away the unearned authority of a patriarch, the societal illusions of a matriarch, and the fraudulent entitlement of a golden child. I had burned the board, and in doing so, I had finally learned how to navigate the open ocean on my own terms. If this story resonates with you, if you see the echoes of your own struggles in the shadows of the Newport estate, I encourage you to subscribe and follow Amanda Told Stories. We explore the raw, unfiltered realities of family dynamics, resilience, and the difficult choices we must make to reclaim our own lives. The world often tells us that forgiveness is the only path to peace, that we must reconcile with those who hurt us to truly heal. But perhaps true peace does not require reconciliation. Perhaps it simply requires the courage to walk away. Sometimes the most profound act of love you can commit is the refusal to participate in your own destruction. And in that refusal, in that deliberate, quiet subtraction of your presence, you might just find that the silence is not empty at all. It is filled with the unyielding, unbreakable sovereignty of a life finally lived for yourself.